Whatever happened to the quieter months of July and August?
Yeah.
Not this year. Not quite last year either. Boy, these 2020s sure are jam-packed.
Right. Welcome, everyone. So, Madam Chair, we are live when you want to go at 8:30.
All righty. Well, my computer via the network is still saying 8:29, so I'll just wait another moment. All righty then. Network thinks it's 8:30, so welcome everyone to the Tuesday, August 10th, 2021 Washington County Board of Commissioners work session. This is Chair Catherine Harrington. Welcome to our Zoom meeting today. And I see Commissioners Pam Trees, Commissioner Roy Rogers, and also in the meeting we have, there she is, Commissioner Nafisa Fai, and at least in a Hollywood Square, we have Commissioner Jerry Willey, though just off camera for a few moments. So we have a jam-packed agenda today. It's a busy time. So I suggest that we go a little bit out of order today because I think we'll want to have some board conversations about various states of affairs. So if I might change the order slightly today and start with leadership communication, that would be, I think, quite helpful. So at this juncture, I'll turn it over to Ms. Tanya Angie, our Chief Administrative Officer.
Good morning, Chair Harrington and Board of Commissioners. Commissioner Willey had just informed me that he's actually on, but had to join via phone. So that's why we do not see his video on right now. So first, I'd like to touch on the heat wave that we are approaching this week. The incoming heat will be more of a concern than the July heat wave because temps will be a few degrees higher. Nighttime temps will remain relatively high, 60 to 70 degrees, and it's likely to last 4 full days. This heat wave will not be as severe as the June heat wave, though. There is some uncertainty over the impact of wildfire smoke, which could possibly lower temperatures slightly. We've activated the county EOC to coordinate our heat wave response. This will be a fully virtual activation during regular daytime business hours. The EOC response team will conduct daily coordination calls through at least Friday and will extend to Saturday if needed. We are again collecting information about cooling centers, and we'll post that on the county hot weather help page in both list and map format tomorrow. And this will be widely advertised. It appears that we will have adequate cooling centers, including 2 pet-friendly centers. Therefore, we have decided not to activate Wingspan as a cooling center at this point. As a point of reference, we did need to activate Wingspan earlier this summer because there weren't enough cooling shelters. However, our plan moving forward is this would be a last resort option. The wildfire potential increases to elevated on Thursday and Friday for our area. This suggests a moderately high risk for large fires. Wildfire risk lowers to minimal on Saturday. I will email this information to the board and ask that Kevin Moss also add this to the packet for permanent record. Are there any questions on this item? Okay. With that, I would ask Clerk Moss if you can promote Marnie Kyle. Marnie will be providing a COVID update for the board. She has a very brief slide presentation as well. Because as always, Marnie's presentations all include data, so it's helpful to see that and also hear that at the same time. So Clerk Moss and team, if you could present Marnie's presentation. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to you, Marnie.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Tanya. Good morning, Chair Harrington and board. It's kind of sad that I'm back in front of you. It's a sign that our numbers are not going in the direction that they had been and that we hope. So my hope today is really just to provide you with an update on the numbers around the pandemic so that it's background and context for you as you have your discussion this morning. So next slide. So as usual, starting with the Oregon numbers, this is as of August 6th, the cumulative total 226,899. Our statewide case rate is 129.3, which does put us in the CDC substantial spread category for cases. Cumulative deaths, you can see 2,880. Test positivity going back up. I don't know if you remember, but we had been below 3% for quite a while. So that's quite the jump. And the statewide 2-week average for new hospitalizations is 143 per week. So people are continuing to get very sick and be hospitalized. Next slide, please. So you've heard a lot about what's causing this increase, this spike that we're seeing nationally as well as statewide, and it really is the Delta variant. And so you can see that beginning in mid-June and then particularly increasing in July and into August. The yellow bar is the Delta variant. So you can see that that is primarily what's driving this increase in Oregon and in Washington County. So next slide. So county community level spread in Washington County, like the state, we're in substantial spread category. So in a 2-week period, we had 660 cases, which puts us at a case count, a case rate of 106.4. And our test positivity is also above the threshold per the CDC substantial spread. And you can see that also our neighboring counties are also in substantial spread according to the OHA categories and high risk according to the CDC. And it's my understanding that OHA is looking toward aligning more with the CDC spread indicators so that we won't have to show you both, hopefully in the near future. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is moving into the folks that are vaccinated. And I guess what I would really point out here is when we report vaccination, we're reporting of the eligible people over the age of 18. So when we say 76.2% are vaccinated in Washington County, which still is the highest in the state, so we can celebrate that. That's good news. But remember, that's of people that are eligible over the age of 18. So that doesn't represent our entire population. And then the second number that you'll see right after the triangle, that's the discouraging number, because that is the percent of change over time. And you can see that that is less than 1%. And we have had that for several weeks now. And so the vaccination demand has really slowed down, and that's what you're seeing in this slide. And you can see that it's similar across all of our metro counties. So next slide. So this is just another look. The darker the shade, the higher the percentage of vaccinated population. And again, that's eligible population, and you can see the number of doses. And that's number of doses, not number of people. So I also just want to make sure that that's clear, that have been provided since we began vaccinating in Washington County. And you can also see where that high demand was on that epi curve, where we were vaccinating several thousand a week, and then now it has come to just a trickle. So next slide. So this is Washington County vaccination data by race and ethnicity, and this is really important to look at because you can see that we still have significant under vaccination in our BIPOC community, in particular among Hispanic and Black populations. And so we still have lots of work to do in that area. And that continues to be really the focus of our vaccination team, is looking at opportunities to get the hardest to reach populations, people that are most hesitant, that have fears about vaccination. And so we're really doing everything we can to focus on increasing vaccination among those populations. Because again, with Delta virus and with the spread, vaccination is extremely effective in preventing hospitalization and death. So you may have heard a bit about that people who are vaccinated can still have breakthrough cases. And with the Delta virus, we are seeing more breakthrough cases, but vaccination protects people from hospitalization and death. So it is still by far the most effective tool that we have in saving lives and preventing hospitalizations. The next slide. So this is looking at hospitalizations, and this is Washington County hospitalizations. And so I think, you know, what you're seeing here is that we have had some increases, but inconsistent in Washington County among or with hospitalizations. What you're hearing quite a bit about is the strain on the metro area health systems and hospitals, and that's related to lots of different variables. So some of it is related to staff shortages, which you've heard a bit about. Some of it is related to people are sicker and they're staying in the hospital longer, and there's been difficulty discharging. And some of it is driven by our surrounding counties with very low vaccination rates, as Chair Harrington heard from Director Allen, I think last week. So right now in Washington County, likely because we have a higher vaccination rate, especially among the elderly, we aren't seeing as big of numbers as other places in the country, but definitely it's concerning, and we're watching the hospitalization rate. And so with that, I just wanted to give you some background and some numbers, and I'm happy to answer any questions and be available as you have your conversation related to any other restrictions that we want to consider within Washington County. And I think the next slide just is a place for questions or placeholders. So.
Yeah, first, let me see if there are any board questions about the information that has been shared with us this morning. Go ahead, Commissioner Treese.
Marnie, can you contrast the difference in Washington County to Multnomah County and what they're experiencing in Clackamas County as well?
Yeah, we can go back a few slides, a couple more. One more, I think. There you go. So you can see that we're all seeing an increase in community spread. We're all in the OHA level of substantial community spread, high case rates. Clackamas County has the highest case rate right now of 148.9 per 100,000, as well as the highest test positivity, with Multnomah County being the next highest, and then Washington County.
I guess what I really wanted to emphasize here is how close we are. We may be substantial, but we're very close. And that's I just wanted to make sure that we talk about that as we talk about what our potential steps are moving forward.
Yes, we're all in, minimally, we're in substantial risk for community spread.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Well, I don't see any other commissioners flagging for questions. So I just would like to raise some comments. I really appreciated how last Tuesday we were alerted through our work session presentation about and our conversation about the new CDC mask guidelines that we were first alerted about the fact that Washington County is dealing with substantial spread of this virus. I was so pleased when we were able to move away from the capacity limits that we had been operating under for almost 18 months, and was just overjoyed that Oregon was able to reopen again. But the fact of the matter is that COVID is a killer virus, and the contagious nature of this Delta variant has changed everything in a matter of a few short weeks. Because of the significant and widespread presence of COVID-19 here in Oregon, but specifically in Washington County, our public health experts all throughout the state have sounded the alarm bell. We have to do something different as a community. We have two very important tools against this virus: vaccines and masks. So here we are in early August with a surge in Washington County and across our state. And I am struck with how our children need us to mask up. Our children need us to get vaccinated. And we're the adults. This is not hard. Like me, many of you may not have children living with you at home, but rest assured, people that you and I interact with on a daily basis do have children living with them. And we need to protect our children. They can't get vaccinated. Children less than 12 years of age are getting sick now, and we can prevent it. We're the adults, teens, 20-somethings, 30-year-olds and above. Let us each protect the children of our community, the children of our lives. Help keep businesses open. Help get kids back into the classroom. We can do this. I know we can do this. I am grateful for the thousands of residents of our community who have been safely vaccinated and are protected against becoming seriously ill or dying, even from the Delta variant. In the last week, as COVID cases have spiked, masks have been recommended by our health experts at the CDC. Just a few days ago, I learned of some perfectly reasonable science-informed business owners who are left wondering about mask needs since the CDC has only recommended them. Well, there is no confusion that masks work. Right now, the status of community spread reminds us that we need to wear masks now whenever we are outside of our own homes. And the situation is that our federal agencies are not in a position to require masking. We have to gather ourselves at the local level to make this happen, to save lives, to reduce suffering in our children, in our employees, our workforce here in our Washington County. You can see it today in our local newspapers. One of our local area hospitals, Providence St. Vincent, is having trouble keeping up with the number of people showing up in the emergency room with COVID-19 and needing those ICU beds. Our healthcare workers are stretched to the max. They need our help. And because our children and other health vulnerable individuals can't get vaccinated, it is on the rest of us to protect them. If you're not vaccinated yet, please do so. It's so easily available now. Since there is so much misunderstanding about the importance of masking and that our children are relying upon us, I'm asking you, my commission colleagues, to join me today in asking our legal and administrative team to craft an emergency status solution to require masks in any outdoor building here throughout Washington County that is not a personal residence. We need to protect our children. We need businesses to stay open because everyone needs consistency of expectation. We, as county government, the local public health authority for over 610,000 residents, we must step up. We must require masks at appropriate times. Because with community spread at significant or widespread levels, we need to require masks when people are indoors, indoor buildings that are not private residence. Now, we're not going to be some mask police. We don't want that, and we don't have the resources. But we know from activities right through reopening the end of June, including with those capacity limit requirements, that signage, education, and support for businesses works. Let's do that again. We did that through June, just 2 months ago. My ask today is simple. Please join me in asking our legal and administrative team to craft an emergency status solution to require masks in any indoor buildings here in our county that is not a personal residence. Whenever COVID community spread is at the significant or widespread levels. The target date for considering such legislation is next Tuesday in our business meeting, at our board meeting. If we do this, we will save lives and we will reduce suffering. I think now's the time. I think we need to do this. Commissioners, any thoughts?
I fully support the action, Chair. I have grandchildren, and I have been concerned for the last several weeks about their safety. We are seeing, and I'm sure we all have friends who know people that have experienced breakthrough COVID cases. This is a reality that we're dealing with, and I believe it's our responsibility at the local level to initiate this work. So I am in support of that.
Good morning, Chair Harrington. I really appreciate what you said, and from a public health point of view, and from a lot of the healthcare, that kind of leadership is what people are looking for in times of pandemic. And I really appreciate you stepping up and sounding the horn on this. We really do need to, and I support the recommendation you're putting forward this morning to require masks in Washington County indoors.
Thank you. And to be clear, once we get below those thresholds as well, we don't need to be requiring masking. So it's just when we get to these levels where we have this peak. Commissioner Rogers and Commissioner Willie, what do you think? And keep in mind, we're not voting today. I'm just asking that we get the legislation developed for consideration.
I appreciate your comments. I think they were passionate and well-focused. I'm not there, and so I won't support that particular motion. I certainly would support continue to monitor. I certainly would support having something in our pocket in case things change. But this whole number counting goes up and down on some basis. I have children, I have grandchildren, I can, match that too. But I just think that we need to watch another couple of weeks, but I have no problem having it in hand, but I'm not there today.
But I do hear you support, let's develop something for possible consideration. Okay. Commissioner Willie?
Yes, and sorry about the the situation I'm in, but anyway, it's going to improve in the next hour. I've got things working, but for right now, this is what you get.
This is fine.
I anticipated that we were going to be doing this. I am supportive of it. The concern I have is just like I think I communicated in our last conversation. I don't want us to be going in and out of this masking situation. So I'd like us to make sure that we're going to put this into place and that we're going to stay the course for a little while, even though we may drop down. Although I understand that the predictions are, which actually have been fairly accurate, that we're going to continue to be at this level or even higher as we move into fall. So, but yeah, I just don't want us going in and out. So I'm supportive of the direction we're going right now.
Well, thank you, colleagues. Ms. Angie and Mr. Carr, and to our public health team, is there any information you need from us right now in order to develop potential legislation for our consideration either next week or subsequently?
No, I think you've given good direction. It's clear where the majority of the commissioners are. Yeah, I guess I hate to ask this, but do you want to do it as a special meeting on Thursday?
I hadn't thought about that. Go ahead, Commissioner Treese.
Actually, I was going to ask about the timing here as well. And, if we're in a situation where we can have the information prepared for us by Thursday, I believe we should consider it on Thursday. I think in terms of what it means from the standpoint of transmission, from the standpoint of hospitalizations, to wait additional days. I'm very concerned about this. So I would support a special meeting on Thursday, but I'd ask Marnie for her interpretation of the situation in relationship to waiting until the following Tuesday.
Yeah, I think that certainly we can work with Tom and draft some legislation for your consideration. Yeah. I agree. We're very concerned about the increasing rate, and we're going to continue to really promote vaccination. But a second layer of protection is that face covering, the mask in any kind of indoor space outside of your home.
One thing that I'm wondering, yes, I'm unmuted. I'm wondering about is this idea of predicting moving forward. So every county is a little bit different. In Multnomah County's case, the chair has a different authority than I have as the elected chair. So Multnomah County Chair Deborah Kafori is issuing an executive order to put these protections in place. And the statements that she has made indicate that this mask requirement may be in place through the end of the year. I am not familiar with what forecast information she and Dr. Jennifer Vines are looking at. I know Marnie, as our public health administrator, you're in very close contact with our Washington County Regional Health. I'm not remembering Christina Bowman's proper, full title. My apologies for that. I'm really reliant upon the expertise of our public health experts. I want to make sure, my goals are very clear. I want businesses to stay open. I want our children to be safe. I want our employees and workers to be safe. And I'm willing to step forward and require these simple masks in order to provide those protections. But I need the benefit of making sure that I'm considering legislation that is backed up by the good science. So moving beyond just my saying, looking for the criteria of substantial and widespread, the widespread nature of this virus in our community. Are there some models that help us understand what sort of trajectory we may be dealing with for the next 4 to 6 weeks?
So there are different models, and I can't speak to them sort of off the cuff, but there definitely are models, predictive models at the national level and at the state level. What I would encourage is that in addition to considering legislation for requiring masks in indoor public spaces, is that we would also really continue to get out strong messages about the other public health prevention strategies, such as encouraging remote work whenever that's possible, really asking people not to have mass gatherings again at this point, looking at really in our enforcement ability and our ability to do education and to get information out to businesses and support businesses who want to cooperate and implement mask mandates. I also like the idea of tying it to the substantial risk categories, because I think as new virus or new variants are introduced, it provides some measure of for the public to understand when might I be required to wear a mask versus when can I relax that requirement. So I think it gives something that's relatively predictable to people to look at. Well, what is our community spread, and that will help direct behavior.
Well, so I think let me be clear. I think in order for us all to feel comfortable with moving forward with such legislation, we do need to have the benefit of at least the OHA models to help us understand the nature of this, because this is a serious step, right? Mm-hmm. But if the model tells us that we're at the top of the peak this week, and we should expect it to subside in 2 weeks, then yes, we will have laid the groundwork for future potential surges, but we will have put ourselves through a bit of a meat grinder on this, and that's not what I'm looking for. So I do think that in your public health role with Dr. Bauman, If we need to call somebody in from OHA to familiarize ourselves with that, that would be most helpful. I'm not going to ask my colleagues to endure the level of press conference with OHA and multiple doctors and a school superintendent, such as Multnomah County did. But I think their united front was also had value, that we have vulnerabilities at our hospitals. We have vulnerabilities in our schools. And this makes tremendous good sense. But I understand Commissioner Rogers wanting to make sure that this is a sustained problem. And also with Commissioner Willie, that we're not going to flip flop. We're not just on the edges, but rather when things look solidly in a danger zone, that we're taking action, protective action.
I would like to just jump in for a moment, Chair. I support following the science. I support following the curves and being well educated as we make these decisions. I also support going through the process so we're prepared to make the decision into even next year if we need to. The other thing I wanted to point out here is I think it's our responsibility to also support the education institutions that are dealing with our children by having a mask mandate when appropriate, so that they are supported in their process. We watch across the country what's happening in places like Florida, and the contentious nature of the local views on this. And I think it's incumbent upon us to make it as easy as possible for our educators to move through this as well.
So let me come back to Mr. Carr's question that Commissioner Treese supported as well, and that is the idea of a special meeting on Thursday to consider such legislation. Commissioners, can you be available for a 1-hour meeting sometime Thursday morning? I know I'll have to move something, but I can do it.
I will be out of town on vacation, first in about 2 years, so I won't be there.
I have an eye appointment that morning that has taken me 2 months to schedule, so I'm not going to be a fan of canceling that either. And just to comment on that, I'm reasonably supportive of this, as I've indicated, but I'm not supportive of fast tracking this on Thursday. I think there's still some data that we need to gather. I think there's some advance notice that we need to be giving businesses and other organizations that are impacted. I would prefer us to let this take its normal course and do it next Tuesday.
Commissioner Rogers, are you back from vacation next Tuesday?
Yes, I get in about 11 o'clock, midnight, but I plan on being there. I might miss a little bit of the morning work session, but I'll definitely be back for the meeting.
Commissioner Treese?
I will be out on Tuesday on vacation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I'm having trouble with my computer.
How about, I understand your eye doctor. How about Friday, folks? I understand Commissioner Rogers will be away on vacation.
The only thing I have on Friday morning is our Arpa meeting, so I'm good.
Commissioner Treese, Commissioner Fye?
It's going to be too hot to be outside anyway.
I have a meeting at 10, but I'm pretty sure we can reschedule. This takes precedence.
Okay, so we'll have a special meeting on Friday we'll get the noticing out. And if Marnie, if you could line up the data presentation for us with that expanded information, and to our team, if you can get at least a draft of the legislation out to the full commission by Thursday morning, that would be great. And we can certainly substitute improvements during the course of the meeting, but that will give us a better anchoring of the criteria that would be most helpful. Does that sound like a plan? Okay, terrific. I know I didn't specify a time on Friday morning. I think I'll leave that to staff to determine. Is it 8:30, 9 o'clock, you know? Stay tuned. I know they'll be on the case. All righty. Anything more on COVID? Because I know we have another topic, another poignant topic. All right. So go. Yes, Commissioner Willie.
Yes, I now have my other technology, so I'm going to be jumping off my phone and onto my computer. So I'll be out for like 1 minute.
Okay. No worries. Yep. I'm going to give Commissioner Willie a chance to get back into the meeting. I think through his computer. Thank you all for that discussion. I appreciate it. And I hope I did a reasonable job of laying out the case, so to speak. So the next topic. How you doing, Kevin? Can you see Commissioner Willie yet?
There, looks like he's joining now.
Okay. How am I doing it? Dragging my heels. I don't usually do that too much. There he is. Victory. Okay. So our next topic, homelessness and homeless encampments. I'll turn it back to you, Ms. Angie.
Thank you, Chair Harrington. And I have asked Sia Lindstrom, Josh Kreitz, and Tom Eggleston to join us. And Sia, if you could help frame this conversation. This is just a status update on encampments. We are scheduled for an upcoming work session to bring you further information on the encampment pilot program, which will include data. And we do know that there have been cleaning efforts and community questions and commissioner questions. So we did want to just take a few brief moments to provide the status update at this time. So Sia.
Good morning, Chair Harrington, Board of Commissioners. Josh and Tom and I are happy to be here this morning to share a little bit about recent activities around our encampments management program. And you all remember back in June, your board had an extensive conversation with the multidisciplinary team about standing up a new encampments management program. This is a 12-month program that is designed to test the waters on how to do more active management of our encampments as homelessness and the impact on our communities of homelessness increases. As Tanya mentioned, we will be coming back for a full update on the progress that we're making on standing up the new homeless encampment program here on August 24th. For now, we want to give you a brief update on the 3 active encampments that we have in place. We have started, as part of the encampments management program, we have started conversations with our city partners, and you'll see some evidence of that in these updates. You'll also see evidence of the fact that those conversations are in progress. And we are working actively to stand those up more robustly. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Tom, who will give us an update on the 3 active encampments.
Thanks, Sia. Morning, Chair Harrington, Commissioners. Thanks for inviting us this morning to give you guys an update. HHS has playing a role in the encampment management program and helping conduct health and safety risk assessments, and then also, if warranted based on those assessments, helping and ensure that the camps are cleaned up and the health hazards are abated. So we have 3 active encampments right now that we're working on. One is 197th and Baseline in Aloha. This is an encampment county has been engaged in for quite a long time. Through the spring, facilities management has been working with the campers, and we had brought in porta potties and toilet services and hand washing stations, and been providing some trash removal services. The camp has been there quite some time. It was pretty big. Following the kind of kickoff of the program, or the light launch, Sia likes to say, building the airplane as we fly it. We have created a health and safety risk assessment that we'll talk a little bit more about at our update in 2 weeks, I think it is, if I'm correct. The camp at Aloha scored kind of in the high range of the health and safety risk assessment, but not high enough to immediately take action on it. We have kind of a 2-week grace period window. So the health and safety risk assessment was conducted on July 12th at that encampment. On July 13th, we posted a 2-week grace period warning notice at the site, asking the campers to help clean up and get things under control a little bit better. We provided some services, some waste removal services. We worked with our partners at Metro to have a RID Patrol cleanup come out and voluntarily take waste materials out. Following the 2-week grace period, we went back out and did another assessment on the 27th of July, and we found that there was still substantial health and safety risks at the site. So we felt, based on our procedures, that it was incumbent upon us to notice the site. We posted it on the 29th of July for a 5-day posting for cleanup and removal of the encampment. And then the site cleanup started on the 5th. So last Tuesday, the cleanup started. It was much larger than we had at first known. Once the cleanup crews got in there, they realized there was a lot more material back there than we had expected. They're actually still out there today, I think, finishing up the final touches on that cleanup. We are going to continue monitoring the site and conducting risk assessments. We do expect folks will likely return. It's been an area that has been camped in for a long time, and we want to make sure that we stay on top of the situation so that we can manage the health and safety risks so it does not become what it was again. The next one I will talk about is the Oak Street and Baseline in the city of Hillsborough. This encampment is located on a county-owned lot that was an old gas station car wash that was acquired through a tax foreclosure in 2015. It's in Western Hillsborough, kind of right in front of the Community Action Organization and Dick's Country Dodge area there. That site is unique in that it is in the city of Hillsborough, but owned by Washington County. So we are working with the city of Hillsborough to try to understand next steps and work cooperatively with the city to kind of come to an agreed upon solution and best actions going forward. So yes, Chair Harrington?
Just for clarity, is this, unlike the Aloha site that is in a creek area, is this the one that I was just by a couple of times yesterday where there are RVs versus tent sites?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a mix. There's tents in the old car wash bays. There's some tents along the backside of the old building, and there's a line of RVs along the property line on the east side there. It is a very different site. So our risk assessment we conducted out there in mid-July as well, found different kind of findings based on the environmental impacts and the danger, fire danger, and those kinds of things were very different because the site, like you mentioned, is not a green space. It's not next to a waterway. It's not in a vegetative area. So there's a different set of risks and levels associated with it. And that's what we're working through with the city of Hillsborough to really understand how the risk assessment criteria applies in the city of Hillsborough and what the outcomes of those decisions are. And we want to make sure that we're on the same page with the city before we take action out there. The next property we'll update on is the Highway 47 property. This one has got a lot of attention over the last week. This property is located off Highway 47 north of Forest Grove to the east of Porter Road. This is kind of located in a green space between Council Creek and Highway 47. This property that was acquired as a right-of-way during the Highway 47 expansion project. So it is county owned and it is in unincorporated Washington County, but it is just across the street from the city of Forest Grove. This site, we did our risk assessment on the 16th of July, and we found substantial risks at the site. It's a very large property, 11 plus acres Lots of folks out there, lots of structures, lots of evidence of drug use. There's some reported crimes that were out there. So it scored high on the risk assessment criteria, and our procedures recommended an immediate cleanup and abatement of that property. So we move forward on that pathway forward. Contractors did a walkthrough on the 26th to help us understand the scope of work for a cleanup. We communicated with stakeholders, and we learned in a conversation with Forest Grove last night that we could have done a much better job with the city, and we plan to do a better job going forward with the city and the advocacy organizations out there. We did post the site on the 4th of August for a 5-day notice, and cleanup began yesterday morning at the site. So that's really the status update on those 3 properties, and I guess I'll hand it back to you, Sia. Unless there's any questions about the technical or the operational details, I can answer those too.
Yeah, at this point, we're happy to open it up for questions. We do have Josh in the room as well, who was, Josh and Tom were at the Forest Grove City Council meeting last night, and we got really great feedback from the City Council there on the partnership.
Go ahead, Commissioner Treese.
Thank you, Sia. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Josh. I got involved with this because Mayor Truax was trying to get a hold of Commissioner Willie, who was on vacation. He called me, so I ended up involved in some of this as well. And I attended the Forest Grove City Council meeting last night in Zoom capacity. And Josh and Tom did a great job. They really did. And it was, I think it was well received by the counselors. Tom, I would disagree with you just a bit. I think you did a great job. And the message that came back was really about communicating in advance and making sure that that communication was solid. But there was also a recognition that this was on a pretty fast curve. So there was some balance there. I texted with Mayor Truax after the meeting. He wanted to make sure that when I reported to the commission about my attendance, that I compliment both of you on your presentation, but also the way that you answered your questions. You know, there was some tensions were a little high, and you both did an excellent job in fielding those questions and not adding to the tension level. So thank you for that. And I just wanted to, like I said, chime in here because I happen to be in the audience. So thank you.
Good for you. As I was setting up my computer to join in, I thought, we're going to have a whole bunch of staff there. How much overwhelm are we going to have on this? So I chose to close my computer and rely upon staff on the situation. So, but good for you. That's great. So part of what I have a question about is we've tried to be clear and consistent. So as we entertained this pilot project as a board, I shared that immediately with the mayors and have continued to rely upon them to share with their city councils and so forth. I've gotten repeated notes of concern from city councilors across Washington County, multiple cities, how that communication just is not happening, that flow. I'm not going to start an email list and start distributing information to city councilors directly. With the Forest Grove site, especially, given the nature of partnership between the city, the foundation, Centro Cultural, Adelante Mujeres, and other active community members. I do wonder about how we can ensure that folks get fair, balanced information about the public health and public safety concerns that both the city police, the sheriff's police, and our public health personnel have been dealing with. There was an article in the newspaper, for example, where some folks were very critical about, well, where were we earlier during the course of the pandemic? And I know from you folks on our team that you were working with a lot of community partners to make sure that we were supporting people in place, following those CDC guidelines. So it's always easier to be critical of someone than to be collaborative. And so I'm wondering, through the course of the conversation last night with city councilors, have you gleaned any feedback that would be useful to sensitize us to, or to share with us now? Or I don't need to put you on the spot. I can just leave the invitation there. I don't want to wait until August 24th to hear about that. So let me just leave that invitation there.
I can share a little bit, Chair Harrington. I think one of, what I heard really loud and clear was the communication is really key. And I think what you pointed out, Commissioner Treese, is earlier communication and coordination and collaboration. And I think we miscalculated that a little bit on this encampment because it's in unincorporated Washington County and it's county-owned property. So we didn't really have the kind of the operational drivers that like we do in the city of Hillsborough property, for example, that kind of forced the conversation earlier and got us in a collaborative mode with the city and working closer with the city on that. So I think we learned the lesson that like I think I've heard CSA, if a camp is close to a city, we need to act like it's in the city, and we need to coordinate closely with the city and help them understand what's going on and help share observation with what we're seeing out there, what our concerns are, and with those advocacy organizations that have been working in that encampment and working closely with them. And I think as this project goes forward, we anticipate this site has been camped in for a long time, and we don't think that people are not going to come back. So we're not fencing the property, we're not trespassing folks, and we do anticipate some folks are going to come back to that property. And I think it becomes even more critical in that phase of the work to work closely with the city and the Forest Grove Foundation and the advocacy partners out there to understand what supports the county can provide and what kind of services we can help them provide in order to keep the situation healthier and safer for the occupants and the neighbors. And I think that's what we need to really do going forward. And if it does turn into a big project, stand up a working group that meets regularly to discuss the situation and what are the plans going forward and how are we going to execute them together.
Well,
Chair.
Ms. Angie, I'll say, I'll follow up with you because I know I was sharing information with you back in May with regard to a city councilor on this, in addition to my communication with mayors in June. So we'll have to do a review on that.
And Chair Harrington, briefly, I can let you know too, the early conversations we've had with our city partners, and this is a preview of what you'll hear from us on August 24th. One of the more difficult concepts is that shelter in place idea, and the idea that we will leave and support in the early stages. And that's just a shift for many of our partners who are more used to moving people earlier. So that's part of the conversation that we're having with our city partners. Also, many of them are very interested in having us speak with their city councils, to your point about communication.
And to that point, I expect to be invited to every single one of those, along with the district commissioner.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful. I appreciate that. And we will make sure and do that. And we will bring information about that on August 24th as well. Thank you for that. Commissioner Treese.
While Tom mentioned the different pieces of the the communication, I think I was struck with the relationships that are built with the city and their local advocate. And you've said this, both Josh and Tom, but I think the relationship they had with Sean there was extremely tight, and looking for those types of relationships as we work through these issues into the future, and leveraging the relationship to the best possible way is something I would encourage too.
Go ahead, Commissioner Willie.
Thank you. And I had to step away for like 1 minute, so I hope I don't repeat something that you've already said. So I apologize for that. The feedback that I get, because I'm getting a lot of communication from residents who are impacted by these camps, and also by businesses impacted by these camps. And in my communication last week with Thomas and others, it became apparent that we're going to actually try and put some sort of facilities, as Thomas indicated in his report, that we're not just going to go in and clean them up and leave them like they are. We're going to try and enhance them, so to speak. And I'm certainly in agreement with that, because these folks need some place to be, and they are going to come back. And that's certainly the 197th and the Highway 47 camps. So I'm certainly in support of us putting some of those facilities on site there. What I also heard yesterday, and it was, it wasn't just a rumor, it was a report of sort, that when we when we opened up the fairgrounds last year and invited the homeless community in there as a camp, almost immediately the police were made frequent visits to Albertsons and the small shopping center there, as crime significantly increased almost immediately. And then when we closed the camps, it went away almost immediately. And we can't tolerate that type of activity and still, to me, provide at least a reasonable living place for our homeless community. There's got to be some code of conduct. There's got to be some balance, that there's an expectation that if they want to live in these camps, and I'm saying that assuming that also if those who are living there want to have housing, we can work hard to facilitate that, so it's a balance. But we also know that there's a contingency of the homeless community that they want to live in these camps. And so I'm concerned about the degree of crime that goes along with the neighborhood surrounding this. And this also applies to our turnkey project at the Econo Lodge. So we've got to have some sort of, I guess, commitment to those folks who live in neighborhoods and businesses around these camps, as well as trying to make these camps a little bit more livable. So that's a really, really fine line, but that's the messaging that I think is important, and that's what I'm hearing back almost on a daily basis now. I am talking to people about these camps and about our homeless community. So that would be my ask, and certainly stay in communication with our public safety folks, HPD, Forest Grove Police Department, as well as our sheriff. And then in regards to meeting with the city councils, I completely agree with that. I just ask that when you schedule those in the cities that are in my district, would you please also loop me in on that so I can participate as well. I should have been on last night. I didn't realize we were doing that, but also I had a meeting and didn't get home till 6:45 anyway. So that would have been a little bit tight. But so thank you for that. And again, I can't say thank you enough to Thomas and your team for all the things that you're trying to do to make this some sort of livable situation, I guess, for everyone around. So thanks for your hard work and to your team.
I think there's something that I'm going to need some information help with our August 24th meeting. Our team has worked really hard to ramp up the permanent supportive housing solutions through the funding of the Supportive Housing Services program. And I really believe in the housing first model. Now, through this global pandemic and the economic crises associated with it, we've had an ever increasing population of people experiencing homelessness and the state of homelessness throughout Washington County and our region. I do understand that the CDC is recommending this continued shelter in place strategy, but I find it a little difficult for us to put funds into maintaining these temporary, not meant for long-term habitability sites, and deviating the team's attention away from getting more of the affordable housing and the permanent supportive housing solutions in place. And this is one reason why our team projected the estimated costs for the public health utilization of Arpa dollars. But I think these needs are requiring a reassessment of that and may impact our ability to divert resources more towards the economic recovery, which is very painful for me to even ponder. I feel in a bit like it's digging a hole and continuing to pour water into it. But at the same time, I understand the need and the balance that Commissioner Willie is illustrating. So I would just challenge the team to bring information forward to us about making these difficult choices. Are we better off to live some short-term pain in order to get a better return on investments for the dollars? I don't know the answer yet. I need some more information. I don't want to just keep pouring more money into the hole, to use that analogy, which I don't mean to belittle any human on the planet with. But that's all I have. Any other comments or questions from any commissioners? Okay, well, leadership communications. Ms. Angie, was there anything else you wanted to share with us? This is why we extended leadership communications today.
I think that's enough for today. I do want to just share appreciation for the board of this quick check-in on encampments. The team is learning and growing through this, so please continue to share your feedback as we move forward, even if you have additional feedback before we come before you at the work session. And the comments and questions today are helpful as we prep for that discussion. And that's it from me today.
Mr. Carr, what do we want?
Thank you, Chair. I agree. I have nothing further to add.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Taniguchi Dennis, Clean Water Services.
Thank you, Chair Harrington, and good morning, Board of Directors. I just wanted to let you know that Clean Water Services continues to be in stable operations, and the team is actively managing the COVID situation as well as the heat. So they're ready for whatever comes to pass in these next upcoming weeks. So thank you for the board support, and also thank you to the team for being very proactive and in their thought and actions that they're undertaking.
Okay, we'll turn it over to board communications. Commissioners, what would you like to share today? Anything, or are we talked out?
I can go next. Can you guys hear me? Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. I'll be quick. Since last week we had our board meeting on Tuesday and our roundtable discussion on Thursday. My week was not too busy with too many meetings, but I was able to squeeze in some meetings with constituents. I also had a meeting with Representative McLean, mainly to check in since being sworn into office, and we talked about partnership touch points on transportation. One thing I want to flag for our discussion later on this afternoon is that Stephen and Chris will be providing an overview on Washington County's transit improvement initiatives. They will be talking about the county's partnership with TriMet, and since TriMet has a new general manager, Sam Dessou, we were wondering if we should invite him to present to the board. And I'd like to come back to this after we hear from Stephen and Chris' presentation and talk about whether that invitation should be to a regular board meeting or to a work session, and what timing would be most appropriate for that invitation.
Well, on that point, the TriMet board has a history of meeting in each of the TriMet districts. It had been twice a year. COVID has thrown a wrench in that works, and I think they're trying to figure out their outreach plans with where we're at with reopening, as well as having a new general manager. So having met with the prior general manager just a couple of months before his resignation with their outreach team, they know they have a standing invitation. So I think we need to respect the work of the TriMet board as well, and reach out to them too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Chair Harrington. Last week, I took part in my first ribbon cutting event as an elected official. The Alperson on 185th and Farmington in Aloha is now a Safeway. And that store for our neighborhood got us through the pandemic. And I was glad that I had the opportunity to extend my gratitude to the frontline workers. Those cashiers were working day and night to provide to the community and keep that store open. And then last week, I also met with Under Sheriff John Cook and learned a lot about the great work Lieutenant Mitch Coley and the deputies are doing, helping people experiencing houselessness, especially in the Beaverton Creek camp. There are success stories. I highly recommend, if you have not done so, to connect with John and Lieutenant Mitch. I attended the CPO 6 monthly meeting. There are a lot of questions about the Beaverton Creek camp. Lieutenant Mitch Coley and the deputies did a really great job answering the questions in the most respectful and dignified way. I feel like people on both sides of the spectrum on this issue were satisfied with their answers. Obviously, I got some questions directed at me, and I was able to contribute. So to round it off, we are in the midst of planning the August town hall that I'm doing on the 19th, and that will be focused on homeless encampment in the county. And that's my update. And thank you for listening. I turn it back to you, Chair.
Other commissioners, anything else for today? Go ahead, Commissioner Willie.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I would say that I'm spending a good majority of my time working on the Econo Lodge turnkey project and dealing with talking to a lot of the Latinx businesses that are in that neighborhood, working with the chamber. We have another public meeting scheduled for next Monday night. I had requested of about 12 people yesterday to have a pre-meeting at 4 o'clock at the chamber, and we did that. Some great ideas came out of that conversation, and so we'll continue to prepare for the next public meeting. And certainly after that meeting, provide maybe a little bit more of a complete recap of some of the information and some of the recommendations that are coming out of these meetings. And I give Josh and Jess and Comey, all three of them were at this meeting yesterday. I appreciate their time and certainly their commitment to finding the solutions on this. So we will move ahead and work on that. And then the other thing is this next Tuesday is it next Tuesday or is it today? Oh, it's today. Is the Western Oregon State Forest Management Plan update. It's a 2.5 meeting to give us an update on the where we are with the forest management plan, with the habitat plan, and just kind of a recap of everything. I'm sure we'll get some forest fire updates in there as well. And so that will be happening later on this afternoon. And so, yeah. I'll certainly give you more information on that next week when we get back together. So I think that's all I got. I did enjoy 3 days of vacation last week as well.
That's great.
Pam, were you going to jump in? I didn't mean to jump in front of you. Go ahead. All right. As I mentioned, I'll be gone on vacation Tuesday and I'll be home Monday. So I'll make the meeting that you're talking about Friday. I might not make much of the afternoon meeting today. We're trying to get all ready. It's traveling is a bit more hectic with not only vaccine passports, but indicating a number of things. So that would occur. I got busy yesterday, so I didn't give everybody my full agenda. Today at 4 o'clock, I'm meeting with the sheriff. He's concerned about comments I made regarding how you might price different districts. If I said that was just a discussion point, but in regard to the ESPD, had a good conversation with Jason Snyder, mayor of Tigard, yesterday. He had called about an unrelated matter, but he also wants to deal with a little bit more understanding on the whole urban service issue. That's a key point. He shared with me that he and the chair had talked about that a bit as well. That's a flashpoint. I know it's also a flashpoint for folks in Tualatin. I've chatted with them and Sherwood. Had a lot of discussions into last week. I don't know what happened last night at the Tualatin meeting, but we had, I think, crafted a fairly good proposal for the Parkway, Salt Creek Parkway. And so anxious to hear what happened. I get back and I meet with Matt Craigie. He wants to go over all the fine work that I think that Jerry and Pam have been doing with him. I'm not sure what's all going to be. We have that, and then not last but not least, we Chair and I have spent a bit of time dealing with some maybe what you would call unique criteria, but some maybe more modernized criteria in evaluating Diane in regard to her role as the chief executive officer, and that'll all be done hopefully by the end of the month, and then we'll bring something for everyone to view and go through and see what additions, changes that you might make. So that's my update.
Go ahead, Commissioner Treese.
my mouse isn't working on my computer, so I'm struggling with big fingertips on small screens. So I apologize for that. Couple things. I met on Friday of last week with the Professional Business Development Group. That's Kenichi Oneguchi, I believe that's how you pronounce her last name, and Beth Cook. It's a minority and women-owned business trade association. They wanted to let me know what the scope of their work is. We talked about the work that they do. I want to encourage Matt Craigie to talk with them. And also I've already talked to Commissioner Willie about talking to them. They are in the process of applying for Arpa grants and that type of thing. That's separate from the fact that we should just know what their organization is, what they do, and how we as a commission engage. On Monday, I met, as well as Nafisa, I met with Representative McLean. We are going to be scheduling regular meetings so that we're just in touch about what's happening from her viewpoint at the legislature and what's happening in Washington County. So I think she's doing a really good job of outreach right now. A couple other things. I met with Sarah Beachy. We all know Sarah from her work on the budget committee. She's also an employee of the Beaverton Educational Foundation. Sarah is interested in the Washington County community position on MPAC. I talked with Chris Defaba to find out what the process is there. I'm getting more information about what our role as county commissioners might be in relationship to that position and what type of referral we might make to Metro Council. So I'm just raising that with you so that you know that Sarah had expressed that interest to me. I'm also going to be on vacation starting next Tuesday through the following Tuesday. I'm going to make every effort to at least call in to the meeting on the 24th. I believe that's the second Tuesday. Yes. And see, I might have some road noise, but I've got a mute button. So we'll see how that goes. But I will be out of reach during that week time period. So that's my update.
Thank you. Well, I think that's all four of you. I'll just contribute that there have been a whole bunch of meetings around COVID state of affairs, homelessness, you name it. And I sent you all a summary of the meeting with Governor Brown Friday morning. On Wednesday of this week, there is a town hall with Representatives Campos, Schouten, and Senator Lieber, along with Mayor Beatty. So continued interactions there and good constituent flow of information on what the legislature has done to help our community and what happens moving forward. And that includes the ARPA dollars that legislators directed. Of course, they were waiting for the legislative office to check the Treasury rules for all of those projects. And here we are now on August 10th, and I don't know yet when that is expected to be completed. But that is something that I anticipate our government relations team will ensure that we have the benefit of. So then I also want to mention that next week, the 18th through the 20th, plans for the AOC Legislative Steering Committee retreat, as well as the Eastern Oregon Summit, that each of those have been canceled for next week, postponed for now, particularly or specifically given the state of COVID spread in Hermiston and Umatilla County. I canceled out of that last week because of the state of affairs. And I didn't think it was right to go spend Washington County tax dollars and participating in those association meetings when the community of Umatilla had such a very low vaccination rate and did not want to bring anything home as a result. So onward we go together in a far more active August than I ever imagined. But COVID and the demands of our community are requiring us to really be focused. So I appreciate that we're all helping one another and doing what we can do to share information. So that's it from me. Are there any last thoughts before we take a 15-minute break and then come back to our other work session topics? Nope. Okay, well, it's almost 5 minutes before the hour. Why don't we reconvene at 10 minutes past 10? And with that, we'll pick up with the Washington County budget, discretionary community investments, then follow up with ARPA conversation try and get all that done before the lunch break, and then finish up with our last topic around transit improvement after lunch. Sound like a plan? Okay, we'll see y'all back here in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Welcome back. I have talked with Chair Harrington. She's asked me to run the meeting. So I'll wait until everybody signs in here, and I need to call up the agenda on another computer. Perhaps Clerk Moss, you could call up the agenda.
Commissioner Vice Chair Teresa, I can just so we have our next item is Washington County Budget Discretionary Community Investments from Letitia Tillman, our Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer, for you.
Thank you, Clerk Moss, and I apologize for not having the agenda pulled up. Letitia, welcome, and we look forward to your presentation. I believe that we are all here now. Let me check to see. Yes, we are. So please continue, or please start.
Okay, thank you, and good morning, Vice Chair Teresa and members of the board. Before I begin, let me just verify with Clerk Moss that this is the updated version of the PowerPoint.
Yes, Latricia, it is.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. So as you'll recall, during our most recent budget season, the board asked me to develop some recommendations regarding how to embed equity in the process for determining future discretionary investments in community. And several of you have shared that this area of the budget has not benefited from the strategic thinking of the current makeup of the board and reflects decisions made almost 2 decades ago. So what I'm bringing you today is a series of questions and some recommendations for your consideration and discussion today. And then the direction that you provide on these budget areas can be woven into the overall budget process going forward. So next slide. So I just wanted to be clear about what is in the scope of this conversation and what's out of the scope of this conversation. So very much wanting to be clear that this is about recommendations around the scope of various budget categories and a potential process for allocating future discretionary community investments. This is not about me making any recommendations around funding level, about me making any decisions about process or recommendations or decisions about what entities do or do not get funded and at what level. Those are either decisions that the board needs to make or decisions that will come out of a process if you'd like to go in that direction. So next slide, please. So I just wanted to start by kind of grounding us in current state in terms of our budget and the way that it's organized. So next slide, please. There are 3 fund areas that I'm going to focus in on. One is non-departmental, which currently represents about $800,000 of investment, and it represents a mix of investments that include countywide dues, commissioner allocations, some subject matter or department specific investments, as well as some investments we would consider to be employee benefits. Next slide. So community network represents investments that came out of a 2002 Vision West process. And several organizations have gotten funding through this fund category, as well as building maintenance funds for some organizations. And that represents about $750,000. And the next slide. So this bucket area is currently denoted as a lottery program. And that supports funding for various chambers of commerce and business kind of collectives or collaborative efforts, as well as some organizational investments and some county operations that align with the state lottery funding rules and requirements. And the next slide. So with that overview of the funding categories, you can kind of see how there's not really clear delineation of what each of the categories focuses in on and what the goals and objectives of the categories are. So I have some proposed budget category clarifications to offer, and then also some additional questions for your consideration. Next slide. So in terms of the non-departmental bucket, my recommendation would be to have this bucket really focus on countywide dues and Board of Commissioner allocations only. And that is because many of the other line items have a home somewhere else in the organization, in the countywide. So things like TriMet and United Way, those dollars and those line items could move to HR because we would see the TriMet passes as an employee benefit, and HR currently administers those. The animal damage control is moving to Health and Human Services, their animal services area. And then there's other elements of that that could be moved into either a specific departmental funding area or community network or lottery. So just some questions around, can we have this bucket focus specifically on non-departmental? One of the questions for consideration is, would the board be interested in pulling organizational membership dues completely into this non-departmental category to reduce potential duplication or increase coordination, or is the status quo okay? So that's a question around consolidating membership dues under this category. I'm going to go through all the questions in this area and then maybe pause at that point to take any questions, because I think this is like one bucket of questions, just how to clean up and clarify these budget categories. So the next one, next slide, is community network. And my recommendation here would be that we continue to highlight partnership with various organizations to address community needs as the focus of this area, but remove building maintenance funds. And my reasoning for that recommendation is that many organizations can capture building maintenance funds now as direct or indirect costs within any contracts that they're engaging in. So removing funding for building maintenance is a smaller impact to organizations, and something that could be recaptured through their contracting process. Another question for consideration by the board is, would the board be interested in pulling sponsorships out of departments into one organizational category under community network, also to reduce duplication and increase coordination? And so that would make the community network bucket more robust than the about $750,000 that currently sit in this funding category. Next slide. So what is currently represented as lottery program in the budget, my recommendation is that we call it economic development. And that's because lottery is the funding source. It's not the desired outcome of the funding source. So really clarifying that and the intent and the desired outcome, I think, would be helpful for the public. Further, the ways that we have invested in our lottery dollars have been true to several of the elements of the lottery fund rules, which includes furthering economic development. But I haven't seen as much explicit focus related to creating jobs and career opportunities, and definitely haven't seen an investment in financing public education. which could be a strategy that the board wants to take on related to addressing critical public service shortages, like we've seen and heard about from Health and Human Services in terms of the behavioral health workforce shortages. And then there may be other public service sector jobs where we are short on the pipeline going forward. Librarians may be an example of that. So that's a recommendation. And then the question for further discussion would be, would the board like to pull various economic development related memberships out of departments into one organizational category? And so this, I think, these questions around consolidation are a very perennial sort of government conversation. Do we want centralized or decentralized? And where are you at as a board in that pendulum swing? So let me pause there briefly, if that would be helpful, to see if there's any questions about just the reorganization of those categories.
Thank you, Latricia. Commissioners, are there any questions?
I have some very systemic questions, but do we want to go through the whole thing and I ask them then or now?
If they're broader than just these three ways that the categories are organized, I think maybe better to hold it till the end.
Okay.
Any other questions? Commissioner
Yeah,
Riley?
yes, thank you. So under the lottery slide that you presented here, it says finance public education. I'm assuming that's something that comes out of the lottery fund definition, not from us. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Clerk Moss, if you could go back to slide 10, I pulled that directly from the Oregon administrative rules around allowable expenses for lottery funds that get allocated to individual counties.
Okay. Yeah, I just don't know how that fits into our criteria, but I get it. I think I like the direction you're going here. It is going to be interesting to see how we move some of that money around, because as your slide indicates, it's $3 million. And I know a significant portion of that has gone to LUT, and I don't know if that would fit under the current scenario. So where would we get that? I mean, we're not going to cut LUT by $750,000 or whatever it is. So we'd have to get that from another pocket. So anyway, I'm assuming that in our next discussions, we would see how we're reallocating certain funds from other funds. And so anyway, because we do have a fairly defined criteria of where we can spend that lottery money, yeah, that would be, I think, the responsibility of us, obviously, that we meet that criteria, but how would that look differently than what we've been doing? But I'm certainly supportive of that, because that's been, to me, that's been a little bit like peanut butter. So, and then if you could go back up to the non-departmental slide.
That would be back to.
Yeah, that one. And it says, add government alliance on race and equity. So can you give me a little bit more detail on that?
So this is also a national organization membership due that the county currently pays, except I believe it gets paid either out of HR or OEICE, but it is a membership due that is national that benefits the whole county.
Yeah, and I think what was interesting to me was going through your slide presentation. It's a little different than the one you've got right now, but what was interesting about it is a little bit of a budget refresh of how we kind of pick and choose well, we got this fund, but this fund doesn't really have any money, so let's take it out of that fund. And there isn't any really consistent rationale to that. So I like the direction you're going here. And also if, the TriMet tickets, and can you hear that noise in the background?
Just a little bit, not probably as loud as it is for you.
The house I'm in, I'm staying in my son's house right now. He's got an electrician and he's cutting sheetrock. Okay, so I'm surprised I can even hear you. It's definitely not as distracting
for us as it is for you.
That's good. Anyway, the TriMet tickets, I'm a supporter of that, but I always like to know that that's really a good investment. How many of our employees actually get the tickets and actually use them? Because that's $200 and some thousand, and certainly something that I don't think we should automatically take for granted, that it's just an automatic every year. It's a lot of money, and I just don't want us wasting any money if it's really not being utilized. So that would be my only comment to that.
Right. And the reason why I recommend moving it to HR is that it is definitely communicated as a benefit that helps with the recruitment of staff to Washington County. And I think probably aligns with the conversations you were having last week about sustainability as well.
You bet. Yeah. Thank you.
And Commissioner Willie, we can provide further data, utilization data on that benefit as well.
My understanding, Latricia, is that what we're talking about here is a reorganization of the budgetary issues, not necessarily an evaluation of the effectiveness of any of these programs or dues or anything at this time, correct?
Right, correct. Not at this time.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Latricia, Commissioner Treese, if I can just add on to that, this is also leading us to budget transparency by ensuring that expenditures are connected to appropriate funding sources. And so that's part of this identification process and conversation that Latricia is lifting up right now.
Great. So
are there other questions? Let's keep going.
Okay, great. So then if we could go to slide 15. What I'm going to pivot to now is around process changes, because part of the ask was how do we embed equity into any kind of funding decisions made for these three bucket areas going forward. So the next slide would be a proposed timeline of how a competitive process might look. And really the intent of my proposing a competitive process is that it gives multiple organization an opportunity to make a case for why the county should be investing in them. And for the process to be public and transparent with clear criteria and guidelines, as well as communication about why particular organizations are funded. And so through a competitive process, the board would begin by adopting the model. So saying, yeah, this sounds like a great idea. And then adopting priorities. What are the areas that you're interested in using community network funding or economic development funding to support? That's something that we would need to communicate, develop a process and communicate that out to community-based organizations or as early as possible. And as soon as we know the budget numbers that would be allocated to these three bucket areas, or really two bucket areas, with a proposed deadline for January for proposals to come in, a spring review of applications, and then recommendations for funding to the board, which organizations to fund so that it can be woven into the budget adoption process. So that's a quick overview. The competitive process, if you'd go to the next slide. Oh, you know what? We might have skipped forward a little bit. If you could go to slide 12. So the competitive process would not apply to the non-departmental area if we focus in on countywide dues and Board of Commissioner allocations. Those determinations would be made through the current process. The county administrator goes through for countywide dues, or if the board wanted to direct the allocation of those dues, that is a potential decision that the board can make. And the board members obviously would continue to direct their own board allocation funds. So this category would not be a competitive process. Through community network, which is the next slide, the board would determine the outcomes that you are wanting to achieve with accountability to particular milestones. And then there would be an external community funding process, and that those funding recommendations would come through that proposal process. And then the next one, economic development. As you mentioned, Commissioner Willie, there is a significant part of the lottery fund dollars that currently fund internal county programs and staff. And that my proposal is not to change that process, but for economic development related dues, that would also continue to be staff recommendation. And I'm particularly thinking now that we have an economic development manager, Matt Craigie, he could help lead that process of determining where we're investing in economic development dues. And then the remainder, there's a small proportion of the lottery fund dollars that are allocated to community organizations, that would be included in the external community funding proposal process. So it would be a competitive process, and then those recommendations would come through that process, again, focused on board priorities and desired outcomes. Okay, so let me pause and see if there's any questions on that part.
Any questions? Is it time for Commissioner Rogers to jump in here?
I think, yes, probably this is the best time because the slides beyond this assume more conversation and discussion if you would like to move forward with that external competitive funding process.
Okay, thank you, Vice Chair. I'll make some generalized comments. First of all, I like the approach. It's been well overdue that we take a look and see how we fund various activities. In days of old, what we always did is, because we were a contract county, and we still are for many things, we tried to establish a nexus between these so-called contributions and what we were getting. And so you wouldn't just simply give an allocation. There had to be a fee for service, except for the SIP agreement that we negotiated with Intel, and that's that discretionary money that the board has, and the dues. Those were in our mind, those were different, but all the rest, I'm all for, and I may be alone in this, and that's fine, going back to every organization and every department and categorizing very similar to what you're doing and saying, tell us what you provide to the county. What service are you providing that we don't already have internally? And it's not just, well, we need the money to continue to function. That's not a good answer. The answer is, we provide these things that you don't currently provide. Absent that, and Mr. Tom Carr, I asked this of Alan quite some time ago, and my law is a little bit rusty, having been in college days, but there's specific on-target ORS about making contributions, i.e. donations to organizations, that don't have value or a nexus of value. I could go back and find it, but I mean, you can't just tax somebody and give it away to somebody else. I mean, there has to be some value received. And so if the board is not inclined to say, what are we getting in value, then I think we need to revisit that statute and say, are we in compliance? So now let me be even more specific in regard to the lottery funds. Those are pretty well established in law as what those were going to go to. And I would certainly welcome a robust conversation around those. That I think we can find a nexus pretty easily. I don't think that's going to be too difficult. In regard to the non-departmental, I concur with what's being said. There's absolutely no reason for a lot of that to be a non-departmental. I think it shifts to the departments if you can again establish the nexus. The same thing with the community network funds. So my general summation is that I'm pleased to see it being done and the questions being asked. I think they're miscategorized. I think if the departments have some need for these kinds of investments, and let's get the nexus so we don't have a donation issue under the statute. I mean, that's pretty simple. In regard to the lottery, I'd certainly like to peg those to what they're really intended to do, and that's economic development. And I think that we've had a couple of commissioners on our board who've been quite involved with that, and I think that shouldn't be too hard to tag those. And frankly, a discussion, and I won't name names right on the spot here, but there are contributions being made to organizations. I wonder why, because we're providing the same service, and I know it's been historical. And I don't know that we're not doing the same thing, and the monies are just kind of a gift to them. I don't think we should be propping up anybody. It's not tax oriented. I understand the Visitor Association because of the nature of the taxes, so that's a different one. And I understand libraries. I understand a lot of different ones, but just to give organizations money without a nexus is not where I want to be. So if I'm sounding a little cranky, I think it's because this conversation is well overdue. Previous boards should have had it. This board's taking on the issue, and so Tanya, I know that Tricia's presenting, but I know your fingerprints are all over this one, and I appreciate you being brave enough to do it. So that's my comments.
Are there other questions, comments? Latricia, where would you like us to go from here?
Okay, well, let me, it sounds like there's not any serious concern about cleaning up the categories in the way that's proposed. I'm not hearing significant concern around moving forward with a competitive process in the areas of community network or economic development in the areas that I've suggested. So I want to just
I'd like to chime in here and say that I support Commissioner Rogers' comments, and I think it is time that we did this. And just from the simple fact that we shouldn't have categories named for their source, not their purpose. I mean, that's really good work, and separating these out into the right buckets so that we can appropriately go to the next phase, and as Commissioner Willie said, and look at how we're spending this money and is it effective. So I think that we're on a continuum here in terms of making sure that we're spending the money appropriately. I also believe that I heard Commissioner Rogers say that we should not be the sole support of organizations that or close to the sole support of organizations, and we should be reviewing those budgets as well. And I would support that. Are there other comments? Latricia, Do you have recommendations then?
Well, yes, why don't we go forward then? So I already shared with you the timeline if we do move forward in this way, and then I can talk to you a little bit more about the funding criteria, which is really the opportunity to embed equity in the work going forward. So if we could talk about that. In a competitive process, we would establish criteria that centers transparency and racial equity, and that would be standardized across the application process. So some sample criteria include asking organizations to demonstrate that racial inequities exist in the services in the areas where they're providing work and service, and that the funding that they're requesting would actually center the communities with the greatest need, that their board and staff leadership and diversity demonstrate a connection to the communities served. So whether they're culturally specific, there's a robust connection at the leadership level to that community, or if they are responsive to the broad multicultural community of Washington County, that their board and staff also represents that. That there's an organizational focus on communities impacted by present and historic inequities as demonstrated by data, that proposed service recipients align with data showing racial inequities, and then that there would be demonstrated equity outcomes and an organizational equity statement. So these are just some examples of what could be included as considerations in identifying organizations that Washington County, the board wants to continue to invest in. The next slide, this gets to the comment around how much and are we the sole source of funding? So I think that the board could really benefit from a discussion about your philosophy on supporting versus sustaining organizations. So would the board want to distinguish between grants, which may be renewed annually, or an operational partnership, which may have a longer time horizon, for example, to support a startup organization over a period of time? Does the board want to establish a maximum number of consecutive years that a partner organization can receive funding? These are all questions that you could say as a board you want to weigh in on, or you could say, nope, we want staff to figure this out and come back to us with a proposal. And then the third question, same thing, does the board want to establish a top threshold of an organizational budget that you're willing to fund? And what would that maximum percentage of an organizational budget be? And so that, I think, gets to the point where there are some organizations that have a significant proportion of their budget dependent on Washington County investment. And so those are questions. Again, the board can say we want to weigh in. The board can say we want to delegate that and have staff come back to us with a proposal. Next slide. And sorry about my little editing. The accountability structure, I think, is something that's really important for the board to have a discussion about, because my understanding is historically there's not a standard process for report back to Washington County on the outcomes of investments. Some organizations may do it just as a matter of their process, but whether we require it as a standard is something that has not been as consistent. So the question would be, does the board want to require an annual report for organizations receiving grants and operational partnership investments? And does the board want to establish other accountability measures? So are there specific process or outcome measures you want to see? Are we asking for a particular return on investment for Washington County residents, particularly when we're investing in a regional or statewide organization? Or what is the equity impact? If the annual report is insufficient, is there any impact on future funding eligibility? And if the award from the county exceeds a certain amount, would you want that recipient to present publicly at a board work session, just demonstrating that there's a higher level of accountability with a higher level of funding. So those are some additional questions for the board to consider. And then I can wrap it up in, I think, 2 more slides. The next slide just pivots us to change management. And so recognizing that this is a significant change in how the board has operated, it's a significant conversation that is new to this board that prior boards have not had. I think it's really important for the board to consider the impact. So the next slide, what might be the positive impact of a change in the board's approach to funding in these categories, including other organizations that might now see a pathway to receiving this kind of funding from Washington County. And then, of course, there may be negative or unintended consequences of a change in the board's approach. And so trying to anticipate what those might be then helps us to get ahead of it and what might be needed to manage any changes in the approach that the board adopts. So those are my final questions. And I, again, come to you today with way more questions than answers. And so I'm happy to hear any further questions or comments that you might have, or if you're comfortable asking us as staff to continue to move forward and approach.
One clarifying point here, Latricia, we are talking about under these discussion questions, we're talking about organizations that receive funds from Washington County. We're not talking about organizations that have a dues structure, correct?
Correct.
Okay, I just wanted to make that clarifying point for everybody here.
And we're talking about organizations that are specifically funded out of these 3 buckets of funding, not organizations that may have contracts for services with other departments.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much. Are there questions, comments? Commissioner Willie.
Well, and you've got, I'm going back to the kind of the 3 slides, the proposed funding criteria, the proposed funding limit, and proposed accountability. I like those 3 groupings. I guess my question is, were you expecting us to kind of respond to each one of those 3 questions today, or are we just saying that's a good idea, let's do that, come back with a little bit more detail and clarity on those? So what's your expectation of today?
I wasn't actually sure what the expectation was because I wasn't sure how the board was going to respond. And so I think that it could be either way. I believe we have about 10 more minutes for this conversation. So if you have certain answers that you are prepared to give around some of these questions, we can take that and go forward. If you would like for us to come back with a proposed process, we can also connect with you individually, I believe, to make sure that it meets your perspective.
Well, so I'll go bottom up. Accountability. Okay. I definitely think we should be asking for what they did with the money, what benefit it was to Washington County and or certainly constituents in Washington County. And so a little bit of accountability there. I mean, I work with a number of other nonprofit organizations over the years, and almost exclusively, they all have to do some sort of report back, and they have to do some sort of proposal to ask for money. And it seems like we really haven't done that in most cases. And so definitely in the accountability, I like that part of it, and I think we should be doing that. And again, it's because we are using taxpayer money to do these kinds of things and really not asking for much back. And so I like that part of it. I think we need to be doing that. The funding limit part is a little bit more difficult for me to get my head around because as you saw in going through your research on all of these funds and different organizations and things like that, the funding really spread from fairly minimal, $500 or $2,500 or $5,000 up to some fairly significant dollars. And so I don't know how you put parameters around that. I'd much prefer, I think, trying to envision the economic or not economic, the charitable impact of the money and what the organization is going to do and how it's going to benefit everybody who lives and is in Washington County and impacted by whatever the organization that is. So the funding limit part is a little bit more difficult and fuzzy for me. And then the funding criteria, absolutely. I think we, again, just like any other organization typically does that has money, foundations, and those kinds of things, you've got to put, they've got to comply with the funding criteria of what we're trying to get out of that money. So I definitely like the 2 out of the 3. Again, the funding limit one is a little bit more difficult for me.
Are there other comments, questions?
Let me just clarify around the funding limit one. This is, again, is very specific to these funding buckets. So many of our community partner organizations get funding out of this bucket for general operating purposes, right? Without a specific outcome may be required, and get funding through contracts with other parts of Washington County. So the funding limit, if the board went in that direction, would only apply to this area of funding.
Yeah, I get that. And I guess maybe what I'm saying is maybe I'd just like to have a little bit more conversation. So I understood that as well. I mean, we have consecutive years as a board want to establish a maximum number of consecutive years. I don't know. We just committed to a 3-year funding to the Salmonberry Trail. I thought that was a really strong sign. And I know that in each year annually, that organization is going to come back to us and give a report about what they've done, not only with that money, but what they've been able to do in additional monies that they've been able to acquire from other organizations. So I don't have a problem with that, but I don't know if they'd come back, if they'd have said, well, we need a 5-year commitment, would we have done that? We don't have any criteria around that. I don't know. Maybe that's a policy thing that it'd be good to be able to reflect back and say, no, I'm sorry, our policy is 3 years and that's as far as we can go. That doesn't mean we can't renew it for another 3 years. I don't know what that means. And again, with the changeover of our commission, obviously significantly in the last 3 years, how far out do we want to commit future commissions on these kinds of things? And so that's why it's pretty fuzzy to me. So we can have more conversation about that.
Okay.
Commissioner Willie, I think you raised some really good points. And I think we're probably leaning a little bit toward that question about what does the staff recommend. But before we wrap this conversation up, I want to make sure that Commissioner Fye has the opportunity to weigh in.
Thank you, Commissioner Treese. Yeah, I think I definitely agree with what Commissioner Rogers was saying earlier, and I certainly support everything Commissioner Willie is asking for, and I think it's realistic. And yeah, I think we need to have more conversations about this, because I think I see these discussion questions, and then throughout the presentation, there was specific more questions that were asked. So I'm not sure, I'm just sort of struggling where to start in terms of answering. So I'm wondering if you can come back with what is the best practices around, the proposed accountability. How do we answer this question of, does the board want to require an annual report? And then what does that look like? So I'm just wondering, what is the best practice so that we don't reinvent the wheel as Washington County, and that we're sort of situated in best practices, that it's fair and equitable. And then in terms of the competitive process, I'm wondering, like, what do we do with the organizations that have been getting funding from Washington County with our current process? And if we are asking, those establishments to participate in this competitive process, is that fair for us to make them when we set the expectation of continuously getting funding? So I'm wondering, maybe we take a step back and start a weeding process to help organizations figure out where else they can meet their demand if that funding would go away from Washington County. So I feel like and certainly, Latricia, I'm behind on this conversation. It's my first time participating in this budget, but I'm interested in more conversations of, what is the best practices that would work for our community in Washington County, and in answering these questions about exceeding the funding, and then maximum number of consecutive years. Like, what is the best practice? Is it 2 years, 3 years? Then we don't fund that organization, or is it 5 years? And then to answer Commissioner Willey's question around, are we making future commitments to future board? So I think I have to ask a lot of more questions than I had comments, but.
Thank you, Commissioner Fye. I see that the chair has returned. Chair, I'd like to make comments on the last 3 points, and then we'll wrap this piece of the agenda up and move to the next agenda item. As far as
can I make some comments before you do that?
Okay, but yes, of course you may. I'd like to, on the discussion questions, Latricia, I think the positive impact of the change in the board's approach really ties the values and the strategies that we're trying to accomplish to the organizations and to the funding process. That's pretty simple for me. I think that the negative or unintended consequences are that we may lose organizations that we've continually supported before and not understood to a high level what their contributions were. I'm worried about that just a bit. And lastly, I think what would be needed to manage any changes in approach that the board adopts, I believe just this discussion alone is going to cause a lot of discussion in our community at large that we currently support. So we need to have a good communication strategy in place about what the board's doing and what our steps are going to be, because my guess is that many of us are going to receive questions right off the top. So with that, Chair, please chime in and I'll turn this meeting back to you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Treese. So I certainly didn't have the benefit of hearing the whole presentation today with all of you and hearing your questions and comments. I only caught a couple of them. But I know that I concur with a few of the comments that I've heard. This is essentially the starting point of a 2.5-year effort that it has taken to wrestle control of these dollars out of staff's hands and back into the board's hands. This is the start of that weaning off process, to use your phrase, Commissioner Fye, to put these organizations on notice that no longer is the county going to be providing perpetual funding without there being any associated further transparency and accountability for how we move forward. Will that cause consternation? Absolutely. but it's been important that we get that message out in August so that those organizations know for their next fiscal year that they need to put together some plans. And this is the first effort to start hearing from commissioners and wrapping our heads around what kind of program, what kind of communications do we want as we county commissioners follow through on our responsibility for directing funds for investments in our communities and in those relationships. It will have all kinds of thoughts and consternations along the way, but this is where we need to ensure that our staff knows that they need to support us in doing this work. So I consider this the kickoff, and will follow up with the opportunity to go back and watch the whole presentation of this topic and hearing all of your comments and understanding what proposed next steps might be. Thank you, Vice Chair Treese, for running the meeting.
I had one final comment. I made plenty, but the final one would be, again, I stress the need for a nexus between what they do and whether we contribute. But if there's 100% nexus, let's say there was something we don't do at all, I wouldn't want to restrict it to a percentage of their budget because it would be a service. I mean, it would just be what we do. So I agree to the percentage increase, percentages that you might have 20, 25%, whatever you pick. I don't know. It's up to you on their budget. But again, if it's 100% of something we don't do and need, I don't know why we would restrict that. And I just didn't hear that part of it. I thought it was just restrict. And so I wanted to add that.
Excellent. Do any other commissioners have last comments? Thank you again, Vice Chair Treese. I appreciate your taking over. All right. So here we are just after 11 o'clock. Moving on to our next topic then, American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, Proposed Economic Recovery and Community Engagement Investment Areas. Clerk Moss, if you could advance Dorian Russell. Oh, there she is. Welcome, Dorian. I know you're here representing the full steering committee effort, so we'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and good morning, Board of Commissioners. My name is Dorian Russell. I'm the Senior Program Coordinator for ARPA efforts, and I am here representing recommendations that have come out of the ARPA Steering Committee directly from the feedback that we heard from you in our last work session on ARPA. So today there are two areas of recommendations that we'll be covering. The first is in community engagement, and the second is in economic recovery efforts. Can you advance the slide, please? Thank you. So an agenda for today, I'm going to go back and give a brief overview of what was approved at our last meeting together. I'm going to go over the proposed community engagement investment area. I'm then going to invite my colleague, Matt Craigie, to go over the proposed economic recovery investment area. And then I'll open it up to discussion and input from the board. Next slide, please. So as a reminder, what we've done so far, what we are doing, Washington County is saving lives. Our role right now is to protect public health first. We're using our ARPA dollars to invest in people. Within tranche one, that allocation of $40 million for public health and community wellness is going towards surviving COVID-19, meeting basic needs, ensuring shelter and safety, and developing holistic wellness. Next slide, please. I'd like to give a great amount of gratitude toward the presentation that Marnie Kyle gave this morning, because it's a really great reminder that we are continuing to learn how to live amid COVID-19. Our continued response phase and our thoughtful recovery phase are very much intertwined rather than discrete, especially with the emergence of the Delta variant and increases in cases. We continue to protect public health first, and the Delta variant underscores why this is so important. We continue to promote resilience as we continue to offer our reliable services despite uncertainty. And we're continuing to stabilize and support communities with public health and economic recovery investment. Next slide, please. So as an overview of our current ARPA spending and continued response, these are the areas that we reviewed together in June. That $40.7 million in public health and community wellness, $4.4 million for continued operations, and $0.6 million for our business resource centers. So these were the areas that have allowed us to continue to provide a level of service without disruption and to be able to respond to the continuing pandemic. Next slide, please. What we're proposing to you today are additional investments, $5 million for economic recovery efforts, and $1 million for community engagement efforts in order to determine our recovery priorities broadly, including in economic recovery. So the feedback that the ARPA steering committee heard from our last conversation with you was a great desire to go beyond the economic recovery efforts that we've been providing through business resource centers and developing a variety of different programs and efforts through additional economic recovery investment. So we heard you loud and clear, and part of this presentation today is going through how we might spend that $5 million within economic recovery. Next slide, please. So just an overview of where we are, what is happening in the first tranche status. We received tranche 1 funding, that disbursement of $58.45 million. As a reminder, that's one of 2 tranches of funding that the county will be receiving. The conversation we had last time for our continued response spending totaled $45.74 million. And what we're having a conversation about today is that remaining $12.71. Next slide, please. Within that remaining $12.7 million, our conversation today is a request to allocate $1 million for community engagement and $5 million for economic recovery. Next slide, please. You'll see here the scope of our conversation this morning is everything above that dashed line. At a future work session and after the ARPA steering committee has had additional time to continue to review a clean water services request for ratepayer relief and potentially other investment areas within the contingency area, we'll be coming back to you in future work sessions to talk about the remaining portion outside of the half of that $12 million that we're discussing today. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to move into our portion about our community engagement investment and what that framework may look like for ARPA. Next slide, please. So I want to start by discussing this concept of using one-time funds for long-term impact. While ARPA dollars are only one-time funds, we can set ourselves up with the right strategies and the right framework for investment to assure not only that we have an equitable recovery effort, but that we can establish the practices and the structures now to sustain that investment over time. Next slide, please. So in terms of our community engagement strategy for a thoughtful recovery, the ARPA steering committee has considered 3 different aspects through this framework. Next slide, please. The first is adopting a consistent model. So this includes best practice policies and working with trusted community organizations with very deep-rooted relationships throughout the county, and working to have those organizations be compensated by Washington County, as well as other public agencies that are receiving ARPA funding to engage community alongside us. Next slide, please. The next is leading with collaboration. If we commit to a collaborative agreement with other agencies that have also received ARPA funding, and engage under the same community engagement model, we can share and coordinate staff time and funding responsibilities for the effort, and also leverage the variety of different funding streams to reach some of the same shared goals. Next slide, please. This third piece is extremely important and also underscores some of the concepts that Latricia just presented to you in her portion as well. So committing to data equity, this includes committing to a series of best practices in data collection and how we interpret data, how we report our data with transparency, and how we assess outcomes to make sure that what actually happens with our investment is directly tied to our community priorities. Next slide, please. This is our proposed multi-jurisdictional community engagement model. At the top, you see our community members directly informing what our pandemic recovery priorities should be. At the base of this model is Washington County, our elected board of officials, and other public agency partners, sharing together to create the centralized pandemic recovery priorities. So both the elected officials that are representing our community and also involving community in creating those pandemic recovery priorities. On the left-hand side of this model, you'll see community-based organizations, and you see that bidirectional communication between community-based organizations, our communities, and our public agency partners. And this allows us to really build on those trusted relationships and that culturally specific knowledge that our community-based organizations have, so that we can work together to make sure that our pandemic recovery priorities are developed in a way that's equitable and represents a diversity of needs and interests. Next slide, please. The benefits here are in our values. So the ARPA steering committee has adopted this set of 4 key values in how we continue with ARPA. Now that first value, equity, we know that working directly with these community-based organizations with very specialized knowledge and community trust can help us mitigate historical impacts in terms of the barriers to community engagement that have happened in the past. It can help us address the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19, specifically on communities of color. And it's also going to help us achieve a more inclusive set of pandemic priority areas in the central area of that model. Now, for resilience, we know that by committing to this model, the county not only fosters strong relationships with people, but it also would provide the centralized cross-jurisdictional leadership that we would need to develop long-term, holistic, human-centered systems that we can carry using these one-time funds, but setting up the structures to succeed in the long term. For collaboration, we know that there's better outcomes when we work together. We can elevate the lived experience of our community, the community wisdom that our community-based organizations have, and also glean support of multiple different government entities together. I also think it's really important to mention that by leading a cross-jurisdictional approach, we can help our community partner organizations not experience the repetitiveness of having to work with multiple different public agencies and potentially feeling burnout by having multiple different organizations that have received ARPA funding go and ask the same community-based organizations with some of the same requests. That last value in good governance, we know part of good governance is being transparent and being accountable to our community. So in adopting this model and in adopting best practices in data science and evaluation, we can ensure that any of the investments that we have with ARPA, that all of our actions remain directly tied to the priorities that we set with our community. And next slide, please. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Matt Craigie, to go over the economic recovery investment area.
Great, thank you, Dorian, and good morning, Chair Harrington and Board of Commissioners. For the record, my name is Matt Craigie. I'm the county's Economic Development Manager. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this portion of today's presentation is twofold. First, I want to clarify expectations and gather input from you all around economic recovery framing and the process that we're proposing today. And then we'd like to discuss and consider proposed investments, so near-term economic recovery investments. Next slide, please. Keeping with the ARPA framework, keeping the ARPA framework central to this work calls for, as Dorian presented in her portion of the presentation, keeping the framework's values central to this work. And so you'll notice that the phrases here underneath equity, resilience, collaboration, and good governance are slightly different than they are in the ARPA framework, as we've attempted to apply these values to economic recovery. So I'll just read these real briefly. So thinking about equity, how are we, through economic recovery investments, addressing persistent economic inequities, excuse me? With resilience, how are we promoting resilient systems and partnerships? In collaboration, how are we building from community wisdom? And then good governance, how are we seeking transformational and lasting solutions? So we are and will continue to look for ways that economic recovery can embody these values in the work. Next slide, please. We are here. Here's our timeline. We are still in the continued response phase or tier. This means that we're still moving fast to address immediate pandemic-related needs. Very soon, as we're discussing today, we will, with community partners, start the thoughtful recovery phase or tier, where we'll be seeking ARPA investment opportunities that focus on the long-term and transformational change. You'll see that we do have another tranche coming up too. Today, we are talking about tranche 1. There is another tranche of funding coming out in 2022. One thing I'd also like to point out.
I think if I could interrupt, by we, I think you mean the board.
Yes, the board. Yes, thank you. One other point that I'd like to make here in this slide, the ARPA expiration is the end of 2024, and the graphic kind of makes it look like it's the beginning of 2024. Next slide, please. So as Dorian had talked about, and as we heard earlier in this work session with Marnie's presentation, we're still very much within this pandemic with the Delta variant on the rise. So amid the rise of the COVID variants, there's uncertainty about the status quo, what the new normal will be. And because of this situation, there's still the continued need for economic response activities, such as the distribution of PPE, supports for small businesses and workers that are on the front lines. This is also the time of rapid economic growth, but that growth masks the unequal impacts of the pandemic to underserved communities. To give one example, there is a persistent gap in unemployment rates by race and ethnicity in the United States, with Black and Latina unemployment rates consistently higher than of their white counterparts. A Brookings Institution report released in February of this year found that not only did unemployment rates of Black and Latina workers skyrocket above those of white workers during the pandemic, but the gap between Black and Latina rates of those of white workers is now greater than it was pre-COVID. Addressing this type of situation is what we mean when we speak of addressing persistent economic inequities. Next slide, please. So this duality situation, 1 foot in, 1 foot kind of stepping out of the pandemic, calls for a 2-tier response. So our continued economic recovery work on tier 1, the continued response here that we're talking about, is needed to help small businesses and workers manage through the tumult of this pandemic. So to accomplish this aims, we have already funded the business recovery centers, which are providing a very important triage service for small businesses across the county. We have also launched a process as a result of the June 22nd work session with you all, launched a process to identify and fund other small business support organizations with an eye towards those that have deep connections with underserved communities. In my final slide, I will introduce additional measures to support workers. So we'll get to that in just a minute. With your direction and tied to the process that Dorian described, the thoughtful recovery work in tier 2 will be initiated this fall. So in this phase, again, we want to consider multiple interrelated aspects of the local economy: workforce development, business and entrepreneur support, and strategic place-based investments. Next slide, please. Each tier calls for its own method for identification and prioritization of investments. With tier 1, we are responding to the ongoing economic situation. The proposed method here is to rely on knowledge gathered from ongoing stakeholder conversations, staff learnings, and board priorities. With tier 2, we propose to align the process with the multi-jurisdictional plan presented by Dorian. And in this way, we aim to center the voices of community in the work. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for what we're doing for economic recovery? First, I would like to revisit the people, business, place framing that I first introduced during the June 22nd work session. That is a systems level approach to economic recovery and economic development generally considers investments in people, businesses, and organizations that support businesses, and place-based investments like infrastructure and redevelopment opportunities. Next slide, please. In this slide, we have a matrix that crosswalks people, business, place with the 2 investment tiers that we talked about previously. This matrix is intended to illustrate a sampling of potential investments that the county and partners might make within each tier. I want to be clear that these are examples. The point here is to summarize how different investments are called for in each tier. In many cases, the investments are similar, but they're driven by different purposes. Next slide, please. And thank you all for being so patient as I've walked through all of the framing here. This is my final slide, and I'm looking forward to hearing comments from you all. So in this slide summarizes staff recommendations, steering committee recommendations regarding how the county should could approach economic recovery investments at this time. So let's examine this somewhat busy slide from left to right. So first, in the box on the far left, we have investments that have already been allocated. These investments include the business recovery centers and additional funding for community-based organizations that provide targeted support to underserved communities and small businesses. The second 2 boxes, you'll see the $5 million that Dorian had mentioned underneath the second 2 boxes, describes how we are proposing to consider this additional investment from tranche 1 for economic recovery. So in the second box, we have the proposal for the continued response investments. And there's 2 new concepts here that we'd like to discuss. First, we were proposing the addition of 2 additional economic development staff. These staff are needed to support economic recovery activities, including stakeholder outreach, program development, and management. Second, we are proposing an immediate investment in workforce development activities to ensure that there is capacity and support for workers in this tumultuous time. This work, which we would initiate with our workforce partners, would seek to ensure that unemployed workers and those needing to reskill are able to find support. This work could include investments in Washington County workforce systems and community-based partners that together form the support network for the Washington County workforce. It would also seek to provide services and opportunities to low-income workers that have lost their jobs during the pandemic. This work could include internships, stipends, trainings, coaching, scholarships, and wraparound supports. This is immediate funding, continued response, because we've heard overwhelming responses from our partners, including private companies, that it's both hard for workers to find work and for companies to find workers. This effort will aim to bridge that gap. One other note about why this is within the continued response box is, as I'm sure you are aware, on September 4th, the supplemental unemployment insurance will end. And so we expect that there will be more workers, unemployed workers, coming through the workforce system this fall. So we want to ensure that the Washington County workforce system has the capacity and support to help all of those workers. In the final box, we propose that the remainder of the Tranche 1 economic recovery funds. This recommendation is that we tie the identification and prioritization of strategic investments in people, business, place with the multi-jurisdictional engagement strategy that Dorian described earlier. In this way, we can move forward with transformative investments informed by and in collaboration with community. And that's what I have for you today. I look forward to hearing your comments. So back to you, Dorian.
Thanks so much, Matt. Can we advance the slide? So we have a series of questions and identified decision points for the board to consider both in the questions surrounding whether to allocate $1 million of Tranche 1 funds toward community engagement efforts and whether to allocate $5 million for economic recovery efforts. Next slide, please. So our discussion questions for you surrounding community engagement. First is whether the board supports the proposed community engagement model that we presented, and whether the board has input or suggestions on the proposed strategy for the county to take a leadership role in a multi-jurisdictional approach. Again, this surrounds the decision point of whether to fund community engagement at the $1 million level. Next slide, please. Our discussion points for economic recovery include, does the board support the Arpa Steering Committee's proposed recovery investment? And of that matrix that Matt presented, what are the current board priority areas or activities in economic recovery that you've identified as your policy priorities at the individual level or as a board? And this surrounds that key decision point in whether the board wishes to fund ARPA economic recovery with a $5 million investment in Tranche 1. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Chair Harrington, to discuss some of these questions.
So I think it's important that each of the commission members has the opportunity to ask questions and that we walk through the discussion and questions for community engagement and then for economic recovery. Before we do that, just a couple of points of clarification because I don't see it in today's material. We approved a framework on June 22nd. We have high level model proposals today. Subsequent to our discussion and possible agreement in principle to these high levels, could you briefly describe how the board will have the opportunity of perhaps some more paragraph definitions and then weighing in, actually approving of this new model?
Sure, absolutely. So to make sure that I understand your question, beyond just the high-level summary that we have provided today, you would like to see additional detail and information within each of these areas within how we will actually use these funds. Great. So,
yeah, because the funds are limited, you're not going to be able to do everything. So what are we targeting? A lot of things were said verbally, but I think we have to have a little discipline on it.
Sure, absolutely. So in order to begin making plans for community engagement and to begin really scoping out programs within economic recovery, we need to have some understanding of what we're working with, what the scope and what the parameters are for our investment. And so if the board wishes to continue today with the $1 million and $5 million, we would continue to have conversations with the ARPA Steering Committee to provide additional detail and fully scope out what the programs and what the community-based organization contracts would be within each of these investment areas, which should the ARPA Steering Committee approve those frameworks, or I guess more detailed information within these frameworks, it could come back to the board at that point. In terms of the actual programs that we would be funding and who exactly would get contracts, these sorts of things we haven't filled in yet because we need to have some understanding of, are we going to make an investment now or are we going to wait until Tranche 2 for some of these things? So both the ARPA Steering Committee and the staff that support that committee are needing to gain some direction today from the board as to whether we really hit the ground running and begin to in detail scope out what those program recommendations are. Does that answer your question?
Yes. So commissioners, you have my commitment that as a result of today's discussion, we'll make sure that you have some clear written down definitions for acceptance and adoption in action form so that as we move forward with a whole myriad of conversations at all levels throughout our community of Washington County, we all have the benefit of good, clear information. So, okay, so commissioners, who would like to start? Commissioner Willie and I have seen this information as a result of being on the steering committee, but I realize 3 of you have not had the benefit of it. So who would like to start with any questions or comments on the community engagement model and the economic recovery?
Nobody's jumping in, so I'll jump in. What the heck? In regard to the community engagement model, the only thing I have concerns about is the sustainability of whatever efforts. That's always the case when you get these federal funds. I'm much more for the collaborative approach of bringing in other stakeholders and trying to make this somewhat county-wide, because I think, and I might be again in a big minority, but the feds can't continue to send this money out. I mean, inflation is going to run rampant as well as they just don't have the money. So that's the community involvement. Just how do you make it sustainable product that might go beyond the funding and hopefully involve others. In regard to the economic recovery, I like that 5 million, but a couple of questions off the top is that we use the word targeted several times, and I don't know what that means. I know early on we were talking about targeted funds that had zero benefit to my particular district. It was all going elsewhere. So if targeted means that it's not somehow distributed more broadly, then I have a bit of concern about what that really means and what you're doing with it. I'm hoping also with the economic recovery that there is some criteria other than I just need the money. I know in my other hat in the world, a lot of people have gotten money that probably wasn't all that critical for them to have. They I don't tell them that, but they got many millions of dollars from various entities, and there wasn't any specific other than check the box and I attest. There wasn't any criteria that you really maintained employment, that you added employment, that you did anything specific other than say, I needed the money to continue my business. Well, I'm hoping that, and I know, Jerry, you're involved in this pretty heavily with Catherine, but I'm hoping that you're going to take a real hard look at, let's just not give it out like peanut butter. Some businesses are really hurting and they certainly need to assist, but I'd be interested in the criteria that you're going to establish. So that was my comments.
Sure, and I'd be happy to respond to those comments, Commissioner Rogers. First, about your comment about targeted. I used that term a few times in my brief presentation here. One of them is to think about, again, are we making investments in kind of workers in small businesses or place-based investments? So how are we thinking strategically about these different aspects of the local community? Another place in my presentation where I talk more about that, and I think this is what you're getting to, is thinking about the disparate impacts of the economic crisis on communities across Washington County. And so we want to be thoughtful about how we are allocating funds to, like I gave in the example, to communities that have had disproportionate impacts. And so so we'd be looking, to give you an example, be looking to partner with community-based organizations that have deep connections with underserved communities to make sure that those most in need of services, workers, and small businesses are able to access those resources. And so maybe there are organizations that have culturally specific or language skills that can connect with a specific community that is otherwise left out and is falling behind in this economic recovery effort. We want to make sure that we are allocating those dollars to those most in need. And And then what was I lost my train of thought with your last comment there. Oh, accountability. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. No. Very, very much so. We do want to be very accountable with the dollars as they get out the door, and we do have specific criteria. Actually, the additional small business support that I mentioned, we recently released a request for interest and have some specific criteria in there to talk about metrics and the work that will be done, that these organizations will be doing. So we will be expecting reports and metrics from each of these contracts.
I'd also like to respond, Commissioner Rogers, to some of your comments around the value of the investment in community engagement, and also some of the concern for long-term reproducibility. In this moment, we want to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts with other jurisdictions. And so in the very near term, not just in the long term, there's a great deal of value at this time to make sure that we have a strong understanding of what community needs are and also what community expectations are, and developing that data equity and that accountability in order to make sure that the investments we're making now, we're checking in over time with the status of those investments, are actually resulting in the outcomes that we want. So this is an investment in making sure that we've got our priorities straight, and that any investment that we make results in what we want it to result in. In terms of the long-term investment, part of this is the reinforcement of relationships and reinforcement in those social and cross-jurisdictional structures. And I would anticipate that while these are one-time funds, that the learnings and the new modes of engagement that come out of this process will have long-term consequences in a positive way over time as well. Other questions, or Chair Harrington?
Go ahead, Commissioner Treese.
Thank you, Chair. My question is specific around the FTE allocation to FTE. Is that for the life of the ARPA funding, or is that into the future for the organization?
These would be time limited, limited duration FTE positions, specifically working on ARPA funded programs.
Thank you.
I see Tanya may want to jump in there as well.
Yeah, just to clarifying, any position, FTE position that we discuss in relation to ARPA is limited duration for the period of time identified in the ARPA legislation.
I just wanted to make sure that I understood that and that was validated. Thank you.
Commissioner Fye or Commissioner Willie?
Yeah, if I could just jump here, respond a little bit to Roy's comments. This ARPA money, obviously, the amount allocated to the economic development, the business recovery side of things, significantly smaller. As you know, we ended up with $15 million of the CARES money and then another $5 from the state. So basically $20 million, but we also were working with all of the cities in Washington County, making sure that we had allocations and collaboration and for businesses all over the county. This money is a little different in that we are, and that money, the CARES money, was obviously smaller pockets of money, just helping to help them keep the doors open, pay the utility bills, pay the rent, whatever absolutely needed to happen to get them through the worst part of the pandemic. This money is as identified recovery money, and so that's why, and it's much smaller. Some of the cities have received direct allocations of this money as well, so it's a little bit different perspective that we're looking at, and certainly Matt is doing a great job of coordinating with the cities and the economic development directors there, making sure we have a little bit bigger future perspective of how we're going to spend this money. So I'm looking forward to, hearing some of the proposals that Matt and the other ECDEV directors are working on. And it is much more of a future investment, I think, than what we were just trying to keep the doors open with the CARES money. So if that gives you any additional perspective, I would guess, of the thought process that Matt and his team are going through.
Thank you, Commissioner Willie. And if I can just respond real briefly, I am in close contact with the city economic development staff, as I know you all are in touch and coordinating at the elected level as well. So I am really excited about the engagement strategy that Dorian and Latricia and others have been putting together, because I think it's a real opportunity for us to work at multiple levels across jurisdictions to make sure that we are really having a thoughtful recovery here, and we are thinking about long-term transformative investments. So, so looking forward to more of that soon. So thank you for your comments.
Thanks, Matt. And if I may, I do really want to underscore the importance of Commissioner Willie's comment and Matt's clarification too, and that part of this cross-jurisdictional approach is really wanting to leverage the fact that so many other cities, so many other ARPA recipients are also investing in economic recovery and wanting to make sure that we are as strategic as possible with how many different entities are sharing this approach.
Before Commissioner Fye, Commissioner Rogers, I just want to let you know that I can identify with many of the questions that you're asking, and I'll speak to that a little bit later in my comments. Commissioner Fye, how about you?
Dorian and Matt, this is a great presentation. Thank you so much. And I really appreciated the model around the community engagement that you presented. And I'm definitely in full support. And, and in terms of the activities that you were presenting for support, yes, we do need, staff to help move these activities and really make sure that we're implementing a solid program. I was wondering, and I do obviously support the workforce development piece of that activity. And I was wondering, from the community engagement model perspective, how do we incorporate community development and also allocate some funding to really help our community, from a racial justice lens, and dedicate some specific dollars to that focus. So I think I completely support the $5 million for investment. Businesses are, and with the surge now, the struggle is going to really continue for a little bit for businesses. So I think whatever amount we can help businesses ease their mind and help them continue to keep their businesses open, I'm in full support.
I can take some of
that.
Could
you add, Commissioner Fye, what do you mean by community development?
I've heard from not a lot, but few community culturally specific organizations asking, how is Washington County dedicating to culturally specific organizations to do around community development from their own lens. And I think what community development would look like is helping culturally specific organizations help their communities in terms of funneling resources from their perspective and from their lens, is how I understood. So I think they were looking for, specific dedications labeled like that. So that is clear. So I think perhaps maybe Latricia might have some more information to add, because I imagine.
No, I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't the classical definition. I didn't think you meant the classical community development as in land use development.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, Chair Harrington. Thank you. Thanks for clarifying.
Go ahead, Commissioner Treese.
Thank you. When I look at the two questions, the second question is, what are the current board priority areas or activities in economic recovery for future programming? And I just want to shine the light on getting women back into the workforce, daycare issues that are related to that. And I hope that that's part of the structure as you move forward. I'm certain that none of you have forgotten that. I just want to underscore its importance to me. Thank you.
Yep, I'm with you 100% there. We know one of the key barriers to women returning to the workforce is childcare and having stable childcare. That was a problem pre-pandemic. It got a lot worse during the pandemic, and we need to be clearer about how we're doing with that. A lot of heavy lifting happened during 2020 with CRF funding. So before I start my comments, any additional board comments at this stage? Nope. Okay, so I'll go last. Thank you, staff, for moving this forward. I do think that it is a very high level framework that needs some additional fleshing out in order for the board to put its weight around these dollar investments. Specifically, we need to be clearer about what we think those dollars are going to provide for, so that all five of us are clear, but that our community has the opportunity to see that we've adopted this with that clarity. And why do we need this? Nobody's done anything wrong. In fact, you've been very brave about practicing the art of the possibility, and I'm grateful for that. But we have a lot of folks who think we have $58 million burning a hole in our pocket, and we don't. And you're trying to be clear about where there are some boundary conditions for these investment funds. And I support you in that. There are a lot of nonprofits coming at the door thinking we're going to be able to invest significant millions of dollars into the work that they do. With CRF, the CARES Act funds, as Commissioner Willie mentioned, included additional dollars from the state. This agency did tremendous work to try and, if I can use this analogy, stop the bleeding. I mean, COVID hit, we had to close our economy. It was devastating. And so how do we make sure that that it didn't just, that negative effect didn't just keep rolling and rolling and rolling? Well, now we're trying to get back to good health, right? So for some businesses, if you think about a crawl, walk, run model, for some of them, they managed to stay walking and they're trying to get back to running. Some businesses are running already, though they may have some workforce challenges. And then others are just trying to get crawling again. And our team is trying to make sure that no one is left behind. But I do want to mention that I can see how today's presentation is quite high level when I put myself potentially in Commissioner Rogers' shoes. He's asking good questions about what is being targeted, what criteria, and through that discussion, I went back looking at the slides and trying to make sure as a board, as a set of policymakers, that we're being clear about what values we've established for putting these dollars into action towards what goals and objectives. And that's where having some additional definitions, some paragraphs that flesh out these proposals, I think will be helpful. If I can go back to the community engagement slides. Oh, sorry. One more, go back one more, that'd be great. Okay, terrific. On community engagement, I appreciated the slide where you talked about adopt a consistent model, lead with collaboration, commit to data equity. And the proposal for committing funds towards that. But I think there are a lot more questions about, well, does it include this? Does it include that? And quite simply, I think about how we as a board have already talked about how we have all kinds of people coming and running. And for our September town hall, I think we should target a presentation on Arpa. I don't know if that's part of this proposal or not. I just want to inquire about that. Part of what these paragraphs are that I'm looking for is, our staff is having to complete certain reports to Treasury. And I want us to be able to say, by virtue of saying yes to this $1 million investment, here is how we are defining what desired outcomes look like, or what success looks like through desired outcomes. Just some simple expressions of that, I think will be helpful for us. And I have tremendous faith in you along the way. Please know that. You haven't lost me. I just need to help ensure that I and the community members who I am elected to serve have the opportunity to be on that journey with you. So I think my other remarks go to the next slide for the economic development. And Matt, I am grateful that you've joined the organization in quick order. You've really dug in, gotten relationships going, took the baton from the prior consultant and are engaged there. I do, on slide 26, where there are examples, so continued response and then thoughtful recovery. I think I have to keep it in my mind. There's tranche 1 and tranche 2. As I've talked to more and more folks, particularly state reps that serve us, they want to make sure that Washington County as a whole, all of our jurisdictions have worked together so that we have a broadband plan, so that as the state continues to direct dollars into building out that plan, that we can say this is what Washington County needs. And so my concern is we need to prepare that plan now. And I know I believe I've already written something up and sent it to Ms. Angie to get the scoping done on that. And I just want to make sure, is it able to be done with this limited funding, or painfully we'd have to wait? Before I give my full yes to these dollar investments, I need that clarity. On slide 27, oh yes, this is another example where those paragraphs will be helpful because the dollars will only go so far. And I want to, I'll just step back and say that I really want us to be able to make progress as a community with these funds. And you're bringing to us these proposals where we're able to say, well, we need to get these best practices in place so that we can use them here with these ARPA investments, and that base of experience and knowledge will stay with us into the future, long after these one-time funds are available. What I am afraid of is that additional needs in our community, such as the homeless encampment cleanup and putting the homeless community members in temporary hotels, which I don't feel bad about with having a 4-day heat wave coming. Let me be clear here. But once that's done, right? We haven't gotten folks connected back into permanent supportive housing. So it wasn't part of the public health proposal that we originally had and what was going to be needed. And so I'm concerned that as I've heard Ms. Angie mention over the last few days, we've really had this concierge service model that isn't sustainable. And we've been running from problem to problem, and we really have to look at what is sustainable. So where we're really coming to is, in a sense, we in our Washington County community, we still have some of the bleeding going on. We're not as far along as we would like to be in that recovery, but I do want to make sure that we're successful in committing these $5 million, and the cost coverage for those other health and human services and housing needs are going to have to come out of the contingency dollars that are still left. I hope I'm being clear about both what my concern is and my commitment to move forward. You know, I don't want to have to say to the community of the businesses in Forest Grove, sorry, we had to spend that first tranche money on putting people up in hotels instead of helping your businesses. I'd like to avoid those situations, and I'm hoping we're still there. So fingers crossed. So I think those are my comments today. And I just want to ask, as a final wrap up, what sort of time frame you see Ms. Angie, Ms. Russell, in being able to come back to the board with a written proposal, because what I've heard from different commissioners is high level support for this, including the dollar categories that have been proposed. But we want to make sure that we know what it is we're investing in and how we define success for our community. Does that seem reasonable, and in what time frame?
That does seem reasonable, Chair Harrington, and that's what I heard too, is just pulling together all the bits of information we've came to the board on ARPA and ensuring that there's clarity of what the use of those dollars are, so that's transparent with the community. And I do want to just mention in the Health and Human Services Fund bucket, there are dollars for childcare. So I say that as one example of where it would be, we can put that information together and bring it back for as soon as we can get it scheduled on a board meeting, so the board can take formal action on this.
Commissioner Rogers, do you see how those next steps might help with some of the clarity that you were hoping for? And clarity is my word.
I I think clarity is a very good word. I think that it describes some of the needed information, definitional points that you brought up. I think are good. It's not always clear what's happening. The only other point that I didn't make that I would like to make at this point is that the work system piece, always we agree with those sorts of things. It's important. But I would, as one person, would really appreciate if it was targeted to Washington County. I mean, to get lost in the bigger morass of expenditures. This is Washington County money. It's residents we're trying to help. So, to Andrew or whoever, McGough or whoever we're talking to, do some targeted programs in Washington County. I don't think that's a big ask. So that's my only other comment. But thank you.
And I think, going off my recollection of the Lift Us Up, Keep Us Going report on CRF, I think they really did try to put that into operation. And now we're hoping to continue to build off of that. So that's great. Commissioner Willie, were there any last thoughts or remarks you wanted to make?
Yeah, thank you for giving me that opportunity. And I'm, Tanya, thank you for clarifying the childcare. I was going to ask that question anyway. I thought there was some money allocated in there. And then I thought I was hearing you, Chair, talk about our legislators' request that we allocate some money for rural broadband, or for just broadband. I'm getting in trouble for saying rural broadband. So broadband. And yes, I think if we could, I guess I'm anticipating, because we still have our consultants still working on that. We're not going to see that probably till at least November, December at the earliest. If we could probably just be considering that maybe out of the second tranche, and certainly this is not going to fund broadband in any form or stretch of the imagination. I'm hoping that if we were to apply for some of the federal billions of dollars that they've allocated for that, we might have to have a match. And that's where I'm looking at to see if we've got some of that, or even the state. And obviously, it would be a fairly small amount of money, but at least we've got a little bit of money in our back pocket to do that. So we're trying to anticipate those needs and certainly work within not only the confines of our relationship with Colpac, but certainly as a county overall. And we're trying to expand that perspective, and certainly the need for broadband throughout our county and out into our rural areas. So yeah, I've got that in the back of my mind, still trying to find what that looks like, but that's a little further down the road.
So I understand, Commissioner Willie, how you're working on rural broadband. We need a full Washington County broadband plan, and that includes the urban areas. And there are multiple jurisdictions doing multiple things, trying to figure out where to put different hubs, how to make sure that we do have that network. So what I'm asking for is for the agency to step up to the plate, to provide for that leadership, to bring our various jurisdictions together, because there are dollars that the state legislature would like to dedicate and see dedicated, and we don't have a sound county plan yet. I really value your work for the western part of Washington County in cooperation with those other counties, but we've got to get moving on a countywide plan that connects all of our communities together.
Well, and I certainly appreciate that. And yes, I completely agree with that. Keeping in mind that when we started this, it was pure rural broadband, and it was in coordination with Colpac, which includes 2 other counties as well. So we're kind of walking in parallel tracks here, and we just need to move over and have another track that talks about Washington County in its entirety. And so we can do parallel tracks here. I'd love to have more Matt and I can, I think, have more conversation about what that looks like and how we kind of get that going. I know Mayor
I
Beatty.
got it going with Ms. Angie. Thank you.
Okay. I know Mayor Beatty has called me out a couple of times publicly to stop saying rural broadband. She needs it too. So, so yeah, we just need to have some parallel tracks there, but we can certainly get that done.
So Ms. Angie and Dorian, do you think you have sufficient direction?
Yes, we do. And for clarification, just to reiterate, I am working with the staff team on a scope of work for countywide broadband next steps.
Great, thank you. Good to hear. All right, so that's it for the morning section of our work session. We'll break now for a 1 hour lunch and reconvene at 1:05. Is that okay? All righty, we'll see you a little later, folks.